Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still have a hard time talking about what happened outside Waterloo last year, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. It was April 8th, 2017. I remember because it was the weekend after my birthday, and Ethan and I had decided to take a drive out to the Tennessee River to do some hiking and blow off some steam. Ethan's my buddy from college, and we try to get outdoors whenever we can. The weather was perfect that day, mid-60s, clear skies, sun still bright at 6:30 in the evening when it happened. We were on this back road that runs parallel to the river for a while before it cuts inland. It's pretty isolated out there, maybe one house every quarter mile, mostly hidden behind trees, the kind of place where you can drive for 20 minutes and not see another car. We had the windows down, just talking about regular stuff. Work complaints. This girl Ethan had started seeing, plans for the summer. I was driving my old Ford F-150, and we were going maybe 45 miles per hour. Not racing or anything, just cruising. The road in that area has these long stretches where it's straight for a half mile or so, then a gentle curve, then straight again. We had just come around one of these bends when I spotted something on the right shoulder about 100 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was a person changing a tire or maybe picking something up they'd dropped. "Someone's on the side of the road," I remember saying to Ethan, who was scrolling through his phone picking our next song. As we got closer, though, something felt off. The figure was in this weird position, not standing upright but not on all fours either. It was in this deep squat, almost like a baseball catcher's stance, but with its knees pulled up really high, almost to its armpits. Its head was bent down, completely focused on whatever it was doing with its hands. "What the hell is that guy doing?" Ethan said, finally looking up from his phone. I slowed down a bit, not dramatically, but enough to get a better look as we approached. The figure was on the shoulder where the pavement meets the grass, and its hands were moving through the tall grass in these slow, deliberate motions, not digging or grabbing, more like feeling around for something, the way you might search for your keys in tall grass, but with this methodical precision that seemed practiced. We were maybe 50 feet away when I realized what I was seeing wasn't human. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it's a bear. But no, bears don't squat like that. A hunter in some kind of ghillie suit? But why would anyone be hunting on the roadside in broad daylight? The thing was covered in black hair. Not fur exactly, but hair, short, dense, and lying flat against its body. No variations in the color, no brown patches or gray areas, just pure black from head to toe. The hair looked natural, not like a costume. It moved with the creature's body, shifting slightly as its arms reached forward through the grass. I remember thinking how muscular it looked, even in that crouched position. It wasn't massive like you'd expect a Sasquatch to be from all those documentaries. It was more compact, maybe 6 feet tall if it stood up straight. Solid, dense, probably around 225 pounds of pure muscle. You could see the definition in its back and shoulders, even through the hair. We were passing right by it now, maybe 15 feet away. I had slowed to 30 miles per hour or so, and I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Ethan had gone completely silent beside me. The weirdest part? This thing never looked up, never acknowledged us. No head turn, no pause in its methodical searching. It was like we didn't exist, or it was so focused on whatever it was looking for that nothing else mattered. I couldn't see its face at all, just the top and back of its head, covered in that same black hair. As we passed by, I got this cold feeling up my spine. Not because it had done anything threatening, it hadn't, but because of how unnatural it felt. How wrong. This wasn't a person in a costume. The proportions were off. Arms slightly too long, torso too thick relative to the legs, movements too fluid and purposeful. We drove past it, and for maybe 10 seconds, neither of us said anything. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the curve in the road meant I lost sight of it almost immediately. "Did you see that?" I finally asked, my voice coming out higher than I expected. "What the fuck was that?" Ethan replied. His face had gone pale. "Noah, that wasn't a person." "I know," I said, and hearing myself acknowledge it out loud sent another chill through me. We drove for maybe another 30 seconds, both of us processing what we'd seen, before I made the decision. "I'm turning around." "Are you serious?" Ethan asked, but I could tell he was curious too. Scared, but curious. I found a wide spot in the road and made a 3-point turn. My heart was pounding in my chest as we headed back. Part of me hoped the thing would be gone, but another part, the part that needed confirmation I wasn't losing my mind, hoped it would still be there. "Maybe it was just a weird-looking guy," Ethan said as we approached the curve again, but he didn't sound convinced. In a skin-tight black costume, not acknowledging a truck driving by. I shook my head. No way. We came around the bend, and I slowed to a crawl as we approached the spot. The shoulder where it had been crouching was empty. Nothing there but grass and gravel. I pulled over exactly where we'd seen it and put the truck in park, the engine still running. "It was right here," I said, pointing to the spot beside the road. "I know," Ethan replied. "I saw it too." We sat there for a minute, both of us staring at the empty shoulder. The sun was starting to get lower, casting long shadows from the trees that lined this part of the road. "Let's check it out," I finally said, putting the truck in park and turning off the engine. "Are you crazy?" Ethan asked, but he was already unbuckling his seatbelt. We got out of the truck, and I felt exposed immediately. The air was still warm, but I had goosebumps all over my arms. The spot where the creature had been crouching was just ordinary roadside grass, about knee-high, mixed with some weeds and wildflowers. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. "It was right here," I said, standing where I'd seen it. I crouched down, mimicking the position it had been in, and looked at the ground. It was doing something with its hands right here in this grass. Ethan was standing a few feet away, constantly scanning the tree line across the road and the dense brush that sloped down toward the river on our side. "I don't like this, man. That thing could be watching us right now." I had the same feeling, like we were being observed. The woods seemed darker than they should have been for that time of evening. I stood up and took a step toward the brush that led down to the river, trying to see if there was any kind of trail or disturbance. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Even the breeze seemed to have died down, leaving the air uncomfortably still. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of the river, but nothing else. "Noah," Ethan said quietly, "I think we should go." I was about to agree when I spotted something in the grass about 10 feet from where the creature had been. I walked over and crouched down. There, partially hidden in the grass, was a small pile of freshwater mussel shells, the kind you'd find in the Tennessee River. They'd been cracked open, the insides completely clean. "Look at this," I called to Ethan, who reluctantly came over. "Mussel shells, so what?" "They're fresh," I said, picking one up. The inside was still slightly damp. "And they've been pried open carefully, not crushed. These aren't from an animal." "Raccoons eat mussels," Ethan said, but I could tell he didn't believe his own explanation. "Not like this," I replied. "And that thing wasn't a raccoon." I stood up again and looked downhill toward the river. From where we were, it was maybe a quarter-mile through dense undergrowth to reach the water. No clear path, but definitely navigable for something that knew the area. "I think it was collecting these," I said. "Coming up from the river, gathering food, and we just happened to drive by while it was doing it." Ethan shook his head. "This is insane, man. We should call someone." And tell them what? We saw Bigfoot picking mussels by the roadside? I gestured around at the empty road. Who would believe us? As I said this, I heard a crack from the woods, like a branch breaking under weight. Both of us froze, staring toward the sound. "Time to go," Ethan said, already backing toward the truck. I nodded, suddenly aware of how vulnerable we were. The sun was noticeably lower now, shadows growing longer across the road. I took one last look at the mussel shells, then followed Ethan back to the truck. As I reached for the door handle, I heard it, a low sound from the direction of the river, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. Something between the two, deep and resonant, carrying through the still air. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. We were unwelcome. We got in the truck and I started the engine with shaking hands. I didn't floor it. Somehow that felt like it would make things worse, like running from a predator. But I didn't dawdle either. We pulled back onto the road and drove away, both of us constantly checking the mirrors and windows. "Did you hear that?" I asked once we were a half-mile down the road. Ethan nodded. "What the hell makes a sound like that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have one. The drive back was silent, except for our occasional attempts to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of escaped animal. Maybe it was a hunter in specialized gear. Maybe we'd both experienced some kind of shared hallucination. But we knew what we'd seen. That strange, muscular figure in its deep crouch, methodically searching through the grass with purpose and focus, the short black hair covering its body, moving naturally with its muscles. The complete lack of acknowledgement as we drove past, like we weren't even worth noticing. It's been over a year now, and I still think about that day all the time. I've gone back to that stretch of road a few times in broad daylight, but never alone, and never found anything. No tracks, no more mussel shells, no sign of whatever it was we saw. I've researched Sasquatch sightings in Alabama since then, especially around the Waterloo area. There are a few reports from over the years, usually larger creatures than what we saw, and typically at night. Nothing that matches our experience exactly. Sometimes I wonder if maybe what we saw wasn't a fully grown Sasquatch, but a younger one. The size would make more sense, and maybe that would explain why it was gathering food in daylight, less cautious than an adult might be. The thing that still gets me most was how utterly unconcerned it was by our presence. It never even looked up as our truck approached and passed. Like we weren't a threat, weren't interesting, weren't anything to worry about. That level of dismissal from a wild creature doesn't make sense unless it's so familiar with humans that we're just background noise. And that thought keeps me up some nights. How many of these things might be out there, just beyond the tree line, watching us come and go while we remain oblivious? How often do they crouch beside the roads we travel, gathering food or materials, ducking away before we can get a second look? I still drive that road sometimes when I'm headed to the river. I always slow down at that spot, always scan the shoulder and the woods beyond. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes, especially in the evening when the light starts to fade, I get that same feeling I had that day, that cold sensation up my spine, that certainty that something is watching from just beyond sight. And on those days, I drive a little faster, keep my windows rolled up, and don't stop until I'm back in town, surrounded by streetlights and people. Because whatever that creature was, Sasquatch, unknown primate, or something else entirely, it made one thing clear. Out there, we're not at the top of the food chain. We're just passing through, temporary visitors in spaces that belong to something older and far more at home in the wild than we'll ever be. Story 2. I've needed to get this off my chest for a long time. I've told a few close friends, but they just look at me like I've lost my mind. My husband doesn't even like talking about it anymore. But I swear, on everything I hold dear, that what happened to us that night in January 2007 was real. My husband Rick and I had just moved to a small house outside Deatsville, Alabama, about 8 months before it happened. I'm originally from Birmingham, so this rural lifestyle was still new to me, though I'd always loved the outdoors. Rick grew up around here and knew all the hidden spots worth visiting. That's how we found the old cemetery in the first place. It was this overgrown plot of land deep in the woods, maybe 4 or 5 miles from the nearest proper road. You had to take this narrow dirt track to get there, barely wide enough for our Honda. The cemetery itself was small, maybe 30 or 40 graves, most from the 1800s. The place had been abandoned for decades. Headstones tilting at odd angles, some completely covered in moss, others broken and scattered. Nature was slowly reclaiming it all. We discovered it in summer while hiking and found it strangely peaceful. No one ever went there. It became our little retreat when we needed to get away from everything. We'd bring a blanket, some snacks, and just sit among the quiet graves, reading or talking. Sounds morbid, I know, but there was something calming about it, like being in a place where time had stopped. That particular night, January 15th, 2007, was unusually warm for winter in Alabama. It had been in the mid-60s during the day, and even after sunset, the temperature was comfortable enough to be outside without heavy jackets. The sky was incredibly clear, with a nearly full moon and more stars than you'd believe possible. We decided to drive out to the cemetery after dinner, around 8:30 or 9. I remember Rick joking about it being a perfect date night as we bumped down that dirt road, headlights cutting through the darkness. The forest around us was dense, mostly pine trees with some oak and hickory mixed in. It was the kind of thickness where your headlights don't penetrate more than a few feet into the tree line. When we reached the cemetery, I pulled into our usual spot, a small clearing near the entrance where a gate might have stood 100 years ago. We had planned to get out and walk around, maybe look at the stars from the center of the cemetery where the tree cover opened up. But something made me hesitate after I turned off the engine. I've spent enough time in the woods to know how they're supposed to sound. There's always noise, insects, frogs, the occasional owl, leaves rustling. But that night, things felt different. Not silent exactly, but muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. I mentioned it to Rick, who shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the change in weather or that we were still adjusting to the car's engine being off. So we stayed in the car, reclined our seats back, and gazed up through the windshield at the moon and stars. The moonlight was so bright you could see the outlines of the gravestones clearly, like pale ghosts rising from the ground. It was beautiful, in a somber sort of way. I don't know exactly how long we'd been sitting there, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, when I first heard it. A faint crack, like a dry branch breaking underfoot, coming from the woods to my left, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I didn't think much of it initially. Probably a raccoon or possum, I thought. The woods were full of small animals, but then I heard it again and again. Not in quick succession, but spaced out, deliberate, each time slightly closer. It wasn't the random pattern of an animal foraging for food. This had rhythm to it, purpose. I sat up straighter in my seat, turning my head toward the sound. Rick was engrossed in pointing out constellations above us and hadn't noticed. I didn't want to alarm him immediately. I've always been the more jumpy one between us, so I just casually mentioned hearing something moving in the woods. "Probably just deer," he said without much concern. "They're all over these woods." I wanted to agree with him, I really did, but something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, like someone's eyes are boring into you. It was intense, like whatever was watching knew exactly where we were, while we were completely blind to it. That's when I noticed the smell. At first it was so faint I thought I might be imagining it. But as the minutes ticked by, it became unmistakable, a pungent, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not quite like roadkill or a skunk, but something wilder, more primal, like wet fur mixed with something rotting and earthy. I asked Rick if he smelled it, and he wrinkled his nose, nodding. "Probably a dead animal somewhere nearby." he suggested, but he sounded less convinced than before. The breaking branches had stopped, but the feeling of being observed had only intensified. I kept glancing to my left, toward where the sounds had come from, squinting into the darkness between the trees. The moonlight created strange patterns, shadows that seemed to move when you stared at them too long. And then I saw it. Between two tall pine trees, maybe 50 feet from our car, stood something. Something tall. Something that shouldn't exist. At first my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs, perhaps? But no. This was too tall, too human-like in its posture. It was standing upright, completely still, its massive shoulders hunched slightly forward. In the moonlight, I could make out a silhouette that stood at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. "Rick," I whispered, my voice suddenly hoarse. "Look, over there, between those 2 pines." He followed my gaze, and I heard his sharp intake of breath when he spotted it too. "What the hell is that?" he murmured, but I think we both knew there was no animal we knew of that looked like that. We sat frozen, staring at it, and it stood motionless, staring back. Then slowly, it began to sway from side to side, not moving its feet, just shifting its weight, rocking gently like a tree in a light breeze. The movement was so bizarre, so unnatural, that it sent ice down my spine. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't coming toward us or making threatening gestures. It was just swaying, like it was in some kind of trance. Minutes passed like this, us watching it watching us. The only sound was our breathing, and the faint rustling of its body shifting back and forth. The smell had grown stronger, thick enough to make my eyes water slightly. Rick reached for my hand across the center console, squeezing it tight. Should we go?" he whispered, not taking his eyes off the figure. I couldn't speak, couldn't nod, couldn't even blink, afraid that if I did, the thing would somehow be closer when I opened my eyes again. What was it doing? Why was it just standing there, swaying? Was it trying to communicate something? Was it warning us to leave? Or was it performing some kind of ritual we'd interrupted? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, the creature suddenly stopped swaying. It stood perfectly still again, and I swear, though I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, I could feel its eyes locked with mine. A connection that bypassed rational thought and struck something ancient and instinctual inside me. That's when the fear hit me full force. Not a panicky, screaming fear, but something deeper and more primitive. The kind of fear our ancestors must have felt when they realized they weren't the apex predator. The kind that tells you with absolute certainty you don't belong here. 10 full minutes we sat like that, maybe longer. Neither of us speaking, neither of us moving, just watching this impossible creature as it watched us back. Finally, without taking my eyes off it, I reached for the ignition. The key rattled against the steering column because my hand was shaking so badly. The creature didn't react to the noise. It remained perfectly still, its massive frame outlined by moonlight filtering through the trees. When the engine roared to life, the spell broke. I threw the car into reverse, backing up along that narrow dirt road faster than was safe, branches scraping against the sides of our Honda. I spun the wheel, getting us pointed back the way we'd come, and then floored it flying down that dirt track, bouncing over roots and holes, the headlights jumping wildly. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. Part of me was terrified I'd see it running after us, gaining on us with impossible speed. Another part feared something worse, that I'd look back and see nothing at all, as if it had never been there, making me question my own sanity. The drive home is a blur in my memory. I know we talked, our voices shaky, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Rick kept saying it must have been someone playing a prank, maybe a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. But the size of it, the way it moved, the smell, no human could replicate that. "Sophia," he said at one point, using my full name like he does when he's dead serious. What we saw back there, it looked like... Don't say it, I cut him off. I know what it looked like. We both knew. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Something that wasn't supposed to exist outside of grainy photos and campfire stories. That night I barely slept. Every creak of our old house had me sitting bolt upright, convinced it had followed us home. The smell seemed to linger in my nostrils, though Rick insisted it was just my imagination. In the hard light of the next morning, doubt started creeping in. Had we really seen what we thought we saw? Had we worked ourselves up over a bear, or even just a shadow playing tricks in the moonlight? But then I'd remember the way it swayed, the deliberate, conscious movement of something intelligent, and the doubt would vanish. We never went back to that cemetery, never even drove down that road again. A month later, curiosity got the better of Rick, and he tried to research if there had been other sightings in the area. He found a few vague reports from hunters and hikers over the years. Strange sounds, unexplained footprints, feelings of being watched, but nothing as direct as what we experienced. It's been 16 years now, and I still can't explain what happened that night, what that creature was, why it behaved the way it did. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, an overactive imagination fueled by the eerie setting. But then I remember the smell, the impossible height and breadth of its silhouette, the unnatural swaying motion, the absolute certainty I felt in that moment that we were in the presence of something ancient and unknowable. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story, but I know what I saw. And I know that there are things in this world that exist beyond our understanding. Things that watch us from the shadows when we think we're alone. Sometimes at night, especially when I'm somewhere quiet and isolated, I get that feeling again, of being observed. And I wonder if it's out there still, standing between the trees, swaying silently, waiting for someone else to notice it's there. Story 3. I've thought about writing this down for years, but never had the courage. What happened back in January 2000 changed how I look at the woods forever, and I don't care if anyone believes me or not. I know what I experienced. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me, Jason, Mike, Brandon, and Chris. We'd been planning to camp on Brandon's family land outside Newport, Tennessee. The property is pretty isolated, about 1.5 miles from the nearest house, surrounded by heavy woods and a small creek running through it. I'd been there a bunch of times before without incident. The weather that day was absolute garbage. Steady rain all morning that had soaked everything. We debated cancelling, but decided to go anyway, since the forecast showed clearing by evening. We loaded up our gear, 2 four-wheelers and Brandon's dog Rex into our trucks and headed out around 3 in the afternoon. By the time we reached the property, the rain had mostly stopped, but everything was drenched. The trails were mud pits, which honestly just made the four-wheeling more fun as far as we were concerned. We rode in about 1/2 mile to our usual spot near the creek. The sun was starting to set, and the woods were getting that dim, hazy look they get at dusk. We unloaded our stuff, and Mike realized we'd forgotten the cooler with all our food and drinks back at Brandon's house. So Mike and I volunteered to ride one of the four-wheelers back to get it. It was maybe a 15-minute ride each way, and we figured Brandon and Chris could start setting up the tent while we were gone. The moment Mike and I left, things apparently got weird. Brandon and Chris told us what happened when we got back. About 10 minutes after we'd left, they started hearing heavy footsteps moving through the woods nearby. Not like a deer or coyote, something big and heavy that made the wet ground squelch with each step. They said it sounded like something was pacing back and forth along the tree line about 30 yards from camp. Chris said they also heard this deep grunting noise, almost like someone trying to clear their throat, but deeper and more animalistic. The steps were uneven, like whatever it was would take a few steps, stop, then move again. Brandon's dog Rex started acting strange too, not barking but whining and staying close to their legs. The strangest part, they said, was the smell. Both of them mentioned it before I even asked, this heavy, musky odor that hit them out of nowhere. Brandon described it as like something rotting, but also kind of skunky. Chris said it reminded him of wet animal fur mixed with garbage that's been sitting in the sun for days. They never actually saw anything. Whatever was making the noise stayed just within the trees, never coming into the clearing. But they swore the movement seemed deliberate, like it was circling them, watching them. When Mike and I came roaring back on the four-wheeler with the cooler, the noises stopped immediately. I remember Chris and Brandon looking really uneasy when we got back, but they played it off like nothing happened. Brandon just said, "You guys missed some weird sounds in the woods," and left it at that. I figured they were just spooked being alone at dusk. We spent the next few hours setting up camp, building a fire, and riding the four-wheelers around the property. It was a blast, honestly. We rode until well after dark, headlights cutting through the trees, splashing through muddy puddles. By the time we got back to camp around 11 at night, we were exhausted, covered in mud, and ready to drink some beers around the fire. That's when things got truly freaky. We'd been sitting around the fire for maybe half an hour when we heard it. The same heavy footsteps Brandon and Chris had described earlier, but closer now, and much more deliberate. The sound came from the direction of the creek, which ran about 20 yards from our campsite. The creek bed was maybe 7 feet below the surrounding ground level, with steep banks on both sides. We all went quiet. The footsteps were unmistakable, heavy, wet thuds that you could feel in your chest. Then came the grunting again, but louder this time, almost aggressive. Rex immediately tucked his tail between his legs and crawled underneath the nearby picnic table, whimpering. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, but none of us answered. Then we heard a splash. Whatever it was had descended into the creek bed. I remember how unnatural it sounded, like something massive had jumped down that 7-foot drop with ease. We could hear it moving around in the creek, shifting rocks, splashing water. The grunting got louder, more rhythmic, and that smell hit us again, so strong it made my eyes water. It was exactly like Brandon and Chris had described, this putrid, musty odor that seemed to coat the back of your throat. I'd grown up hunting deer and turkey. I'd smelled bears and coyotes and all kinds of animal carcasses. This was different, this was wrong. Chris, who'd always been the most impulsive of our group, suddenly grabbed a rock from our fire ring, a hefty one, probably 10 pounds, and hurled it toward the creek. I still don't know why he did it, fear maybe, or just wanting to scare off whatever was down there. The rock crashed into the creek bed with a dull thud. For a second, everything went silent. Then all hell broke loose. This sound, Jesus, I still hear it in my nightmares, erupted from the creek. It wasn't a roar or a growl, it was a shriek, like someone had taken a bear's roar and mixed it with a woman's scream. It echoed through the trees and physically hurt my ears. Whatever made that sound immediately bolted. We could hear it splashing rapidly up the creek bed, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. Then, most terrifying of all, we heard it climb the opposite bank of the creek, not by scrambling up, but in what sounded like a single bound, 7 feet straight up. "Did you guys hear that?" Brandon whispered, his voice cracking. "It jumped up that entire bank," Mike said. "Nothing can jump that high from a standstill." We grabbed our flashlights and shined them toward the creek, but the light barely penetrated 30 feet into the darkness. Whatever was out there was now on the opposite bank, still moving, circling. The footsteps continued around us, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We could track its movement by sound. The heavy footfalls, branches cracking, and that continuous grunting that now seemed almost like communication. It was circling our entire camp, staying just out of sight. Then it stopped, directly across from us, at the edge where the firelight faded into darkness. We couldn't see it, but we knew it was there. The breathing was heavy, labored, in, out, like it was trying to catch its scent. Brandon had his hunting rifle, but it was still in its case near the tent. None of us dared move to get it. "What should we do?" Chris whispered. "Don't move," I replied. "Maybe it'll just go away." Mike suddenly stood up and shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" His voice cracked with fear, despite trying to sound tough. The response was immediate. From just beyond the tree line came a scream that I still can't properly describe. It started low, then rose to this piercing pitch that seemed to go right through me. It wasn't an echo of Mike's shout, it was a response, like it was mocking us or warning us. Rex began howling, not barking, but these mournful, terrified howls that dogs make when they sense death. "We need to get out of here," Brandon said, suddenly standing. "Now." We didn't even pack up. We grabbed Rex, jumped on the four-wheelers and tore out of there, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind. We rode back to Brandon's house, the entire time feeling like something was following us through the woods, parallel to the trail. When we got back to the house, we told Brandon's dad what happened. He looked concerned, but not shocked. He grabbed his shotgun and drove us back in his truck to retrieve our stuff. The whole time back, he kept saying things like, "Probably just a bear," and "These woods make strange noises at night." But he kept checking his mirrors and scanning the trees. Nothing happened while he was with us. We packed up quickly, the fire still smoldering. Brandon's dad waited in his truck, headlights illuminating our camp while we worked. The entire time I felt watched. That smell lingered in the air, but fainter now. Brandon's dad left after helping us load everything, saying he had to get up early for work. We debated going with him, but decided, stupidly in retrospect, to stay. We were young guys with something to prove, I guess. We moved our tent closer to the fire, kept the four-wheelers ready to go, and took shifts staying awake. Brandon kept his rifle loaded beside him. I managed to fall asleep around 2 in the morning during my off shift. At 3 a.m., Brandon woke us all up in a panic. He'd been on watch and heard the same heavy breathing and footsteps, this time much closer to the tent, maybe 10 feet away. He'd frozen, afraid to move or shine his light. After about 5 minutes, the sounds receded back into the woods. None of us slept after that. We sat up, backs to each other, staring into the darkness until the first light of dawn broke through the trees around 6 a.m. When it was finally light enough, we explored the area. What we found still makes my skin crawl. In the soft, wet ground around our campsite were footprints, not bear prints, not deer, footprints, human-like but massive, easily 15 inches long and 8 inches wide. They showed no arch, had widely spread toes, and sank deep into the mud, suggesting something incredibly heavy had made them. They circled our entire camp, exactly where we'd heard the movement. We followed the tracks to the creek. Sure enough, there were prints showing where something had jumped down into the creek bed, moved upstream, and then, most impossibly, leaped up the opposite 7-foot bank in a single bound. The landing prints on top were deeper, indicating the force of landing, but showed no sign of scrambling or climbing. About 7 feet up in the branches of several trees, we found coarse, dark hair snagged on the rough bark. Not bear hair, which I'm familiar with, but something longer, coarser, with a reddish-brown tint. We discovered something else too. About 50 yards from our camp, in a thicket of downed trees, we found what looked like a bedding area. The ground vegetation was flattened in an oval shape about 7 feet long. The surrounding saplings were broken inward, creating a kind of crude shelter. The smell was strongest here, and more of that same hair was caught on the broken branches. We took some pictures of the tracks with Chris's camera, but honestly, they don't do justice to what we saw and heard. We were packing up to leave when we heard movement again. Just over a small hill about 100 yards from camp. Without really thinking, I walked toward it while the others finished loading the four-wheelers. I don't know why I went alone. Curiosity or stupidity, probably both. As I crested the hill, I saw it, for just a few seconds, but clearly enough that I'll never forget it. Walking away from me, about 70 yards distant, was something upright, something large, 7 to 8 feet tall at least, dark brown to black in color, moving with long, heavy strides that no human could match. Its arms swung at its sides, longer than a person's would be. The head sat directly on broad shoulders, no visible neck. I froze. It must have sensed me, because it stopped for a moment, then continued walking away, disappearing into thicker forest without ever turning around. The smell hit me again, that thick, foul odor that seemed to hang in the air. I ran back to the others, probably white as a sheet. I told them what I'd seen, and we got out of there as fast as our four-wheelers would carry us. For months afterward, Brandon's family reported strange noises near that creek. His father started carrying his shotgun when he went to check their property lines. A neighboring farm about 2 miles away reported something killing one of their goats. Not eating it, just killing it and leaving it. There were other sightings in the area that spring. A delivery driver on a rural route reported a tall, hairy figure crossing the road before dawn about 3 miles from Brandon's property. 2 hikers in the nearby national forest area claimed they were followed for nearly a mile by something that stayed just out of sight in the trees. I've never gone camping there again. When people ask me if I believe in Sasquatch or Bigfoot, I don't engage in the debate. I just remember that night, those footprints, that smell, and what I saw walking away into the trees. I don't need a name for it. I know what I experienced. Something intelligent was watching us that night in the Tennessee woods. Something that didn't want us there. Something that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide or nature documentary. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that heavy breathing just outside my window. And for a split second, I catch a whiff of that musky, foul odor that I can never seem to forget. Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for years. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest. It happened back in May 2013, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My wife Lisa and I had this spot we loved visiting on some private hunting land near Coleman, Alabama. It belonged to my uncle, who gave us permission to go there whenever we wanted. It was nothing special to most people, just a clearing with a power line right of way cutting through it. A small stream at the bottom between 2 steep hills. But for us, it was peaceful, a place to escape. That night in May, we arrived just before sunset. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with a clear sky. Once the sun went down, we sat on the tailgate of my F-150 drinking a couple beers and just talking. Lisa had brought a small cooler with sandwiches. We were catching up on life stuff. Work stress, plans for the summer, nothing important. The kind of conversations you have when there's no TV or phones to distract you. Around 11 that night, we were thinking about heading home when we heard it. A loud snorting sound coming from the bottom of the hill near the stream. At first, I thought it was just the water, but then there was this unmistakable sound of something moving through the brush down there. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, not like a squirrel or rabbit, something big. "You hear that?" I asked Lisa. She nodded, already looking nervous. My first thought was wild hog. We get a lot of them in this part of Alabama, and they can be aggressive if startled. I'd seen the damage they can do, and I wasn't taking chances with Lisa there. "Get in the truck," I told her, trying to sound calm. "I'm going to check it out." I reached behind the seat for my flashlight and my .45. I always keep it with me in rural areas. Snakes, hogs, you never know. Lisa slid off the tailgate and hurried to the passenger door, slamming it shut behind her. That's when everything changed. The moment that door slammed, this deep, guttural growl came up from the darkness below. Not a hog grunt, not a bear, nothing I'd ever heard before in 20 years of hunting these woods. It was low and rumbling, almost like it was coming from inside a barrel. And then, movement. Fast, heavy movement coming up the hill toward us. I jumped up on the truck bed, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The flashlight, damn cheap thing, was barely working. The batteries were dying, giving off just enough light to see a few feet ahead. But the moon was bright that night, thank God. Not full, but enough to see outlines and shadows. I scanned the hillside, moving the dim flashlight back and forth. The growling had stopped, but I could hear something breathing, heavy, rhythmic breaths, and then I saw it. About halfway up the hill, maybe 30 yards away, there was this shadow moving between the trees. Big, much bigger than a person. It was moving slowly, deliberately, like it was trying to stay hidden but couldn't quite manage it because of its size. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I knew, not a bear's lumbering walk or a deer's nervous steps. It was calculated. The smell hit me next. If you've ever driven past roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, multiply that by 10 and add something else, something musky and sour that burned my nostrils. It was so strong I could taste it. Inside the truck, Lisa was freaking out. I could see her through the back window, her face pale in the moonlight. She was saying something, but I couldn't hear her over the blood rushing in my ears. The thing in the shadows made another sound, a kind of grunt, followed by that same deep growl. It shifted position, moving sideways along the hill rather than continuing up toward us. I could hear brush breaking under its weight, small trees bending. Whatever this was, it was heavy. "What is it?" Lisa had rolled down the window a crack to call out to me. "I don't know," I answered honestly, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Start the truck." She reached for the keys, and the interior light came on briefly. That's when the creature stopped moving. I swear it was watching us, assessing. I raised the flashlight again, trying to get a better look, but all I could make out was a large, dark silhouette, partially hidden behind a tree. It seemed to be standing upright now. Lisa started the truck, the engine roaring in the quiet night. She revved it hard a few times, whether from nervousness or trying to scare whatever was out there, I don't know. It worked, though. The shadow suddenly withdrew, moving downhill fast. The speed of it was terrifying. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that quickly. I heard branches snapping, undergrowth crushed under heavy footsteps as it crashed away toward the deeper woods. "Get in!" Lisa shouted, her voice high with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped down from the truck bed, almost dropping my gun in the process, and scrambled into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled with the seatbelt. What the hell was that? Lisa was breathing hard, her knuckles white as she clutched the dashboard. "I don't know," I said again, putting the truck in reverse to turn around. "Not a bear. Too big. Moved wrong." We didn't speak as I drove back along the dirt track that led to the main road. Both of us were straining to hear anything over the engine noise. The road crossed the small stream at the bottom of the hill with a simple wooden bridge my uncle had built years ago. As we approached the bridge, 5 or 6 deer suddenly burst out from the trees to our right, darting across the road in front of us. I slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting them. They were running away from the water, from the same direction where the creature had gone. Their eyes reflected in the headlights, wild with fear. Deer don't run like that unless something's chasing them. "Ryan," Lisa whispered, "please get us out of here." I didn't argue. I gunned the engine as soon as the last deer cleared the road, bouncing over the bridge and onto the gravel road beyond. We didn't say much on the way home, both trying to process what had happened. That night, neither of us slept well. We kept the bedroom windows closed despite the warmth, and I put my gun on the nightstand, something I never do. Every noise outside made us both tense up. In the morning, things seemed less threatening in the daylight. We talked about what we'd experienced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, even though there hadn't been confirmed bear sightings in that area for years. Maybe it was just a really big, wild hog, but we both knew those explanations didn't fit what we'd seen and heard. 2 days later, I went back alone. I told Lisa I was going to check some trail cams on another part of the property, but really, I needed to know. I needed to see if there was any evidence of what had been there that night. I went in the middle of the day, parking in the same spot but staying alert. The place looked different in daylight, just a normal clearing with power lines overhead, trees and underbrush. Nothing menacing about it. I walked down the hill toward the stream, scanning the ground. About halfway down, where I'd seen the shadow, I found the first sign. A patch of grass about 8 feet across was completely flattened, like something heavy had been standing there. Nearby, the brush was disturbed, broken stems and branches showing where something large had pushed through. What really got me, though, were the saplings. Several of them, about an inch in diameter, had been either pulled up by the roots or snapped off at the base. That takes serious strength. A bear might knock them over, but it wouldn't pull them up like that. I didn't find footprints. The ground was too covered with pine needles and leaves. But I did notice a faint trace of that same sour smell from 2 nights before, although much weaker now. I didn't stay long. Something about being there alone made me uneasy, even in broad daylight. When I got home, Lisa could tell something was wrong just by looking at me. I told her what I'd found. "What do you think it was?" she asked, her voice quiet. I hesitated before answering. I think it might have been a Sasquatch." She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I was crazy. She just nodded slowly. "I thought the same thing," she admitted. "The way it moved, how big it was, that awful smell. It matches everything I've ever heard about them. We've only told a few close friends about what happened. Most people smirk or make jokes about Bigfoot hunters. I get it. I would have done the same before that night. But something was in those woods. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was very real to us. We still go camping and hiking, but never back to that spot. My uncle asked me once why we don't use his land anymore, and I made up some excuse about preferring places with better fishing. The truth is, I can't shake the feeling that if we go back there after dark, we might not be so lucky next time. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear that deep growl outside our bedroom window, or catch a whiff of that distinctive smell when I'm out in the woods. Lisa says I'm just being paranoid, but I notice she doesn't like being outdoors after sunset anymore either. I don't have proof beyond what we experienced. No photos, no casts of footprints, just the memory of that massive shadow moving through the trees, the sound of its breathing, and the undeniable feeling that we were being watched by something intelligent, something that decided to let us leave. I've spent hours reading accounts from other people who claim to have encountered Sasquatch. So many details match what we experienced. The smell, the sounds, the deliberate movements. It makes me wonder how many other encounters go unreported because people are afraid of ridicule. All I know for sure is that there was something on that hillside in Coleman that wasn't a bear, wasn't a hog, wasn't anything that should exist according to what we're taught. And to this day, even though we still live less than 30 miles from there, you couldn't pay me enough to go back to that spot after dark. Story 5. I'm mostly a quiet guy who keeps to himself. I work at the assembly plant outside Spring Hill, Tennessee, and I've been on the night shift for 3 years now. Nothing special about my life, really. I go to work, I come home, I do normal stuff on my weekends. I never thought I'd be the type to post something like this, but I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me for 8 years now, and I still don't have any answers. This happened back in March 2015. It was a Tuesday morning, around 2 a.m. I remember because I was listening to that overnight talk radio show about conspiracy theories and had just checked the time when they went to commercial. The night shift at the factory starts at 3, and I always leave early because I like to stop at the 24-hour gas station for coffee before clocking in. The stretch of highway I take is pretty empty at that hour. It cuts through farmland and patches of woods, and you might see 1 or 2 other cars the whole way. It was unusually foggy that night, with these pockets of mist hanging over the fields. The moon was almost full, so there was this weird bluish glow where the fog wasn't too thick. I had my high beams on because there wasn't any traffic, and I was going about 60 miles per hour. Not speeding, really, but moving right along. The radio host was talking about government cover-ups when I rounded this bend in the road. At first, I thought I saw something moving just beyond where my headlights reached clearly. My first thought was deer, because they're all over the place out here, and hitting one can total your car. I instinctively eased off the gas a little. As I got closer, though, I realized whatever was moving wasn't a deer, not a chance. It wasn't darting across like deer do, and it wasn't on 4 legs. This thing was walking upright, and not like a person out for a stroll either. It was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say my hands started shaking on the steering wheel. This thing was crossing from the right side of the road to the left, taking these huge, deliberate steps. I automatically slowed down even more, but I was still approaching pretty quick. The distance closed to maybe 100 feet, and that's when I got my first real look at it. It was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. I've never been into that stuff, Bigfoot hunters and all that. I always thought they were full of it. But there's no other word for what I saw. This thing was gigantic, way taller than any person I've ever seen. It had to be between 8 and 9 feet tall. I know that because later, when I could think straight again, I compared its height to a speed limit sign it had walked past. The creature was covered head to toe in this dark brown hair. Not patchy or mangy looking, but like a full coat. It wasn't shaggy exactly, more like a short, dense fur. The color was pretty uniform all over, maybe slightly lighter on what I could see of its face. And speaking of its face, I didn't get a great look because it only turned partially toward my car, but what struck me was how small its head seemed compared to its body. It didn't really have a neck either. Its head just kind of sat on these enormous shoulders. Those shoulders, man, they were impossibly broad. Like a football player wearing massive pads, except this was all muscle and bone. Its arms hung way down, almost to its knees, and they swung slightly as it walked. The legs were thick, like tree trunks, and it walked with this confident stride, leaning forward a bit, but not hunched over. The whole time, it never broke its stride or showed any sign of panic. It just kept walking at the same steady pace across the road. What really got to me was the way it looked at my car. It wasn't startled or scared. It just turned its head slightly, gave me what felt like a sideways glance, and kept moving, like I wasn't worth bothering with. It crossed the entire width of the 2-lane highway in maybe 4 steps. 4 steps. Then it went through the ditch on the side of the road and disappeared into the tree line. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds, but it felt like slow motion while it was happening. When it vanished into the trees, I realized I had slowed to almost a complete stop in the middle of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The radio was still going, but it was just background noise at that point. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to process what I'd just seen. I briefly considered turning around and going home, but I was afraid of being late to work, and honestly, I was more scared of seeing that thing again than I was of continuing on my way. So I kept driving, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole time. I was going 10 under the speed limit the rest of the way, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the tree lines on both sides of the road. When I got to the gas station, I sat in my car for a few minutes just breathing. The teenage kid working the register asked if I was okay when I went inside. Apparently, I looked as shaken as I felt. I mumbled something about almost hitting a deer and got my coffee. At work that night, I couldn't focus. I kept replaying the encounter in my head. I made a couple of mistakes on the line that the supervisor called me out on. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, though. Who would believe me? I'd worked at the plant for 5 years at that point, and I didn't want to become the crazy Bigfoot guy. For the next few days, I took a different route to work, even though it added 15 minutes to my drive. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to my regular route, I drove with every light on my truck blazing and kept my speed well under the limit. About a week after it happened, I decided to go back to that spot in the daylight. It was my day off, and I figured seeing the place in the sunshine might help me make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe there was something there that would explain it. A weird-shaped stump or something that my tired mind had turned into a monster. But when I got there, the area looked completely normal. Just a stretch of road with fields on one side and woods on the other. I pulled over where I thought the crossing had happened and got out of my truck. The shoulder was narrow, but I walked along the edge of the ditch, scanning the ground for, I don't know what. Footprints, I guess. I didn't find any on the roadside, but the ground was pretty hard packed there. I worked up the nerve to cross the ditch and walk a little way into the tree line. The woods weren't super dense, but thick enough that you couldn't see very far in. About 20 yards from the road, I came across a small game trail, and there, in a patch of softer soil, was what looked like an impression of a huge foot. It was partly washed out from rain we'd had a couple days after my sighting, but the shape was unmistakable. It had to be 16, maybe 18 inches long, way bigger than any human footprint. I didn't have anything with me to measure it properly or take a cast, but seeing that print made my blood run cold all over again. This wasn't in my head. I backed out of those woods and drove straight home. I didn't talk about the experience with anyone until about a month later. I ran into my neighbor Jeff at the hardware store. Jeff owned some hunting land about 5 miles from where I had my sighting. We got to talking about wildlife in the area, and I carefully mentioned seeing something strange on the highway. To my surprise, Jeff didn't laugh or change the subject. Instead, he leaned in closer and asked, was it really tall, walking on 2 legs? My jaw must have dropped because he quickly added, I think I've been finding its tracks on my property. Jeff invited me over that evening and showed me a plaster cast he'd made of a footprint he'd found near the creek that runs through his property. It was huge, easily matching what I'd seen in the woods. He told me he'd found a series of these prints after a heavy rain back in February, about a month before my sighting. He'd made the cast and had been keeping quiet about it, afraid people would think he was crazy. We compared notes on what I'd seen and what he'd found. Jeff had also heard strange noises at night sometimes, not quite like any known animal. A kind of low, rumbling growl followed by what he described as wood-knocking sounds from deep in the forest. He'd assumed it was just hunters or kids messing around, but after finding those tracks, he wasn't so sure. Jeff showed me online forums where people shared similar experiences. Regular folks, not just the die-hard Bigfoot hunters. Reading those accounts gave me chills because so many details matched what I'd seen. The way the creature walked, the proportions of its body, the confident manner it had crossing open spaces. These weren't movie monsters people were describing. They were real encounters that had shaken them just as much as mine had shaken me. I still drive that same route to work, but I never saw the creature again. Sometimes when I pass that spot, especially at night, I find myself slowing down and scanning the tree line. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to confirm I'm not crazy, but a bigger part hopes I never do. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the size or the strangeness of what I saw. It's the way it looked at me, that brief sideways glance. There was something in that look that felt intelligent, like it was assessing me and deciding I wasn't a threat or worth bothering with. It didn't run away from my truck or my headlights. It just continued on its way like it had somewhere to be, something to do, like it belonged there more than I did. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was something else, a guy in a costume who would be out there at 2 a.m., a bear walking upright for that distance with that gait, or some kind of stress hallucination. None of those explanations fit. Jeff and I still talk about it sometimes, usually after a couple of beers when the conversation can drift to weird stuff without it seeming too out there. He's found more tracks since then, usually after heavy rains, always near that same creek, always heading deeper into the woods that stretch for miles beyond his property. The encounters reported in this area have increased over the years. A hiker found strange hair caught on a barbed wire fence not far from there in 2016. A family camping at the state park, about 12 miles away, reported hearing bizarre vocalizations and finding their cooler emptied and carried several hundred feet from their campsite in 2018. Just last summer, a woman driving home from a late shift at the hospital saw what she described as a tall, hairy figure crossing a field in the moonlight. Central Tennessee isn't where most people think of Bigfoot sightings happening. We're not the Pacific Northwest with vast, unexplored forests, but we do have connected woodlands, river systems, and enough remote areas that something could move around without being seen most of the time. I don't know what to make of what I saw that night. I'm not a Bigfoot hunter now. I don't go looking for it. But I do know what I saw, and no one will ever convince me otherwise. That creature was real. It was crossing that road with purpose. And somewhere out there in the woods around Spring Hill, I believe it's still moving through the shadows, glimpsed only by the occasional person unlucky or lucky enough to be in the right place at exactly the right time. The most unsettling thought, the one that still keeps me awake sometimes. If I hadn't rounded that bend at precisely that moment, I would have driven right past where it crossed, completely unaware of what was watching me from the darkness beyond my headlights. How many times have all of us, been that close to something unexplainable and never known it was there? Story 6. I've never fully shared this experience before, at least not publicly, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. I've spent almost 30 years turning these events over in my head, and I still don't have rational explanations for what I encountered. It was late August 1994. I was 17, about to start my senior year of high school, and staying overnight at my girlfriend Jennifer's house. Her parents were heading out of town for their anniversary, and asked if I could stay over to help keep an eye on her and her 13-year-old brother Tommy. They knew we were dating, but they trusted me, and honestly, I think they were more concerned about having an older male presence in the house than anything else. Their house sat on about 5 acres of mostly cleared land that backed up to a stretch of pasture before sloping down toward the Elk River. It was rural Elkmont, Alabama, the kind of place where houses are far enough apart that you can't see your neighbors through the trees, and everyone knows which dogs belong to which families. Jennifer's parents left around 6 that evening. We made dinner, watched some TV with Tommy, and by 11, he was in bed. Jen and I stayed up watching a movie in the living room. Nothing fancy or romantic. Her parents had a strict open-door policy even when they weren't home, and I wasn't about to disrespect that. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Jen went to her room, and I was set up on the couch in the living room. I did a quick walkthrough of the house, checking windows and doors, as I'd promised her dad I would. Everything was locked up tight. The house had this big picture window in the living room that looked out over the front yard, and smaller windows in the kitchen that faced the back of the property. I remember settling into the couch and almost drifting off when I heard it, the distinct sound of the front doorknob turning, not just a single try, but a deliberate jiggling, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. I froze. My first thought was that her parents had come home early, but they would have called. My second thought was much worse. Someone was trying to break in. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering against my chest. "Ethan." Jennifer's voice came from the hallway. She'd heard it too. "Is that the door?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "Stay there." But of course she didn't listen. She came into the living room as the doorknob jiggled again. We looked at each other, and I could see the fear in her eyes that probably mirrored my own. "Should we call the police?" she whispered. I nodded and pointed to the kitchen where the phone was. As she went to make the call, I moved cautiously toward the window, staying to the side so I wouldn't be visible from outside. I peered through a gap in the curtains, but couldn't see anyone on the porch or in the immediate front yard. The doorknob had stopped moving, but that didn't make me feel any better. Jennifer came back from the kitchen and whispered that the police would be there in about 20 minutes. Typical response time for our rural area. "Turn off all the lights," I said quietly. "Let's see if we can spot anyone out there." We went through the house, switching off every light, then carefully looking out each window. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in a pale blue glow. The front yard was empty, the side yards too. When we checked the kitchen windows that faced the back, all I could see was the stretch of yard, then the tall weeds in the pasture beyond, swaying gently in the night breeze. Jennifer's dad kept a shotgun in a cabinet in his bedroom. I'd been hunting with him a few times, so he'd shown me where he kept it and the shells. I'd never imagined actually needing to use it, but at that moment, I was grateful for the knowledge. I loaded it while Jennifer checked on her brother, who was somehow still sound asleep through all of this. "What are you going to do?" she asked when she came back. "I'm going to check around outside," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The police won't be here for a while, and I don't want whoever it is thinking they can just come back and try again." "Ethan, no," she said, grabbing my arm. "What if they have a gun?" I'd thought of that too, but something in me refused to just sit and wait. Maybe it was teenage bravado, maybe it was feeling protective, or maybe just plain stupidity. "I'll be careful," I promised. "I'll just look around the house, not go wandering off." Jennifer reluctantly agreed, but insisted I take the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I checked that the shotgun was loaded properly, tucked the flashlight under my arm, and took a deep breath before unlocking the back door. The night air was thick with humidity, that late summer heaviness that makes your clothes stick to your skin the moment you step outside. Crickets and frogs were singing their usual chorus, which I took as a good sign. Their silence would have indicated something moving around. I moved along the back of the house, shotgun ready, checking around corners and behind shrubs. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no sign of disturbance. I started to wonder if maybe we'd imagined the doorknob jiggling, or if it had been some normal house sound we'd misinterpreted in the midnight quiet. I'd made it all the way around to the front of the house when I noticed something odd. The gravel in the driveway had been disturbed, with what looked like large, widely spaced depressions leading away from the house and toward the back property. Not quite footprints, but something had definitely walked through here. Instead of going back inside like any sensible person would have done, I decided to follow the trail. The marks led past the edge of the manicured lawn and into the field of tall weeds that stretched for about 100 yards before the tree line began. The weeds were high, easily over 6 feet in some places. I'm 6 foot even, and I remember feeling small standing at the edge of that field. The moon cast strange shadows through the swaying stalks, and for a moment I hesitated. But the thought of someone lurking out there watching the house, watching us, pushed me forward. I stepped into the field, following what I could still make out of the trail. The weeds brushed against me, making whispering sounds that set my nerves on edge. After about 20 yards in, I stopped to listen, sweeping the flashlight beam across the field. That's when I saw it. About 40 yards ahead, standing completely motionless among the weeds, was a figure. My first thought was that it was a person. It stood upright on 2 legs. But even from that distance in the moonlight and my flashlight beam, I could tell something was very wrong. The figure towered above the weeds. If those weeds were over 6 feet tall, this thing had to be over 7 feet, maybe close to 8. And it wasn't just tall, it was massive. Broad shoulders, thick torso, powerful-looking arms hanging at its sides. Even at that distance, I could make out defined muscles across its chest and shoulders. But what really sent ice through my veins was its appearance. The creature was covered in pale, off-white hair or fur that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Not like an animal's fur exactly, more like a coating that covered what was clearly a humanoid shape underneath. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing directly toward the house, toward us. I don't know how long I stood frozen, staring at it, but it felt like hours compressed into seconds. My hands started to shake so badly that the flashlight beam wobbled, and I had to readjust my grip. When I looked back up after that split second of adjusting the light, it was gone. Not running away, not moving through the weeds, just gone. There was no sound, no movement, no disturbance in the weeds where it had stood. It had simply vanished. My legs nearly gave out. I backpedaled through the weeds, keeping the shotgun pointed vaguely forward, until I broke free of the field and ran the rest of the way back to the house. I burst through the back door, locked it behind me, and found Jennifer waiting anxiously in the kitchen. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, taking in my pale face and shaking hands. I saw something out there," I stammered. "In the field. It was... I don't even know how to describe it." I tried to explain what I'd seen, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I could hear how crazy they sounded. Jennifer looked concerned, but I could tell she was skeptical. I didn't blame her. I was starting to doubt myself already. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, 2 officers who looked bored and annoyed at having to drive out for what they clearly thought was teenagers being dramatic. I told them about the doorknob jiggling and mentioned seeing someone in the field, but I left out the details about the creature's size and appearance. I could tell by their expressions that they weren't taking me seriously anyway. They did a cursory check of the property, shined their flashlights around the edge of the field, and concluded there was nothing to worry about. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. Or maybe a deer had wandered close to the house. They left after promising to do an extra patrol of the area that night. After they left, Jennifer and I double-checked all the locks and decided to both sleep in the living room. Her on the recliner and me on the couch with the shotgun leaning against the wall nearby. Neither of us slept much. In the morning, while Jennifer was making breakfast for Tommy, I went back out to the field. In the daylight, with birds chirping and the sun warming my skin, last night's terror seemed distant and almost silly, but I needed to check, to reassure myself one way or another. What I found sent chills down my spine despite the morning heat. In the spot where the creature had stood, there was a large patch of flattened weeds, much larger than would be made by a person standing in one spot. The weeds weren't just bent, but pressed down firmly into the ground in a roughly circular area about 4 feet in diameter. Something very heavy had stood there. Around the flattened area, I noticed something else. Several broken weed stalks, snapped clean through rather than bent. These weeds were tough. I couldn't break one with my bare hands when I tried. Whatever had been there was not only heavy, but incredibly strong. I never told Jennifer what I found. Her parents came home that afternoon, and I went back to my own house, carrying with me an experience I couldn't explain or forget. For years, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, a trick of moonlight and shadows, or just an unusually large man who somehow disappeared without a trace. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't the last time I'd see it. Over the next 3 years, before I left for college, I encountered what I believe was the same creature 3 more times, all within a few miles radius of that first sighting. The second time was about 6 months later, in February '95. I was driving home late from a friend's house, taking the back way across Hannah Ward Bridge. It was raining lightly, and as my headlights swept across the far side of the bridge, I saw it standing just at the edge of the tree line. Same massive frame, same pale hair, same stillness. My car skidded slightly as I hit the brakes, and by the time I'd regained control and looked again, it was gone. The third encounter was the following summer. I was fishing alone on Sulphur Creek, about 2 miles downstream from where it meets the Elk River. I'd hiked in pretty far and had been there for hours when I got the distinct feeling I was being watched. When I looked up toward the opposite bank, there it was, partially concealed behind a large oak, but unmistakable. This time we looked at each other for what must have been 30 seconds before I reached for my phone to try to take a picture. As soon as I moved, it retreated into the woods without making a sound, despite its size. The final encounter was the most unnerving. It was April '97, just months before I left for college. I was driving Jennifer home after a date. We'd parked for a while at a spot near Von Hollow, not far from the river. It was around midnight when we finally started heading back. About a quarter mile down the dirt road, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road. The creature was crouched down, examining something on the ground. When my lights hit it, it stood up to its full height, easily 7.5 feet tall. For the first time, I got a clear view of its face. It had deep-set eyes under a pronounced brow, a flat, wide nose, and a mouth that seemed almost human but larger. Its pale hair covered most of its body, but was thinner on its face, revealing skin that appeared grayish in my headlights. Jennifer saw it too. She screamed, and the creature's head snapped toward us. For one terrifying moment, it stared directly at us. And then it moved, not running exactly, but covering ground with incredible speed, disappearing into the woods in seconds. Jennifer was hysterical, and honestly, I wasn't much better. We drove straight to her house without stopping. That was the last time I saw it, but not the last time I thought about it. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings, read about Sasquatch and Bigfoot encounters, but none quite matched what I saw. The pale coloration, for one thing, was unusual. Most Sasquatch reports describe dark brown or black hair, and this creature seemed more deliberate in its actions. Not aggressive, but observant, intelligent. I've tried to make sense of these encounters. Why me? Why those locations? The only common thread I can find is that all the sightings occurred near water, river bottoms or creek banks, in areas with hilly terrain and thick vegetation. Perfect hiding places for something that doesn't want to be found. I've never reported my experiences officially. After seeing how those cops reacted the first night, I knew it would be pointless. But I know what I saw. Jennifer knows what she saw that night on the road, though we rarely talk about it anymore. I'm 35 now, living 2 states away, but I still think about the creature whenever I visit home. I still wonder if it's out there in the woods along the Elk River, watching and waiting. Sometimes I drive past those old locations, half hoping, half fearing I'll catch another glimpse. What troubles me most isn't the creature's existence. Strangely, I've come to accept that. What keeps me up at night is the intelligence I saw in those eyes during our last encounter. The recognition, the awareness, the feeling that it knew me just as surely as I knew it. And sometimes, when I'm back home visiting and the night is quiet, I find myself looking out windows toward the darkness of the woods, wondering if it remembers me too. Story 7. I still don't tell many people about what happened that spring afternoon in 1978. Most folks just look at you weird or think you're making stuff up for attention. I've kept this bottled up for so long that sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. But then I close my eyes and it all comes rushing back, crystal clear, like it happened yesterday instead of 40-some years ago. I was 13 that spring, spending a couple weeks at my grandparents' cabin near Elk Creek in western Kentucky. I loved that place. It was my escape from school and the suburbs where we lived most of the year. The cabin sat on this gentle slope with thick woods all around it. About 200 yards behind the cabin was this swampy area, not deep, just knee to waist deep water with a bunch of hardwood trees growing right out of it. Beyond that swamp was a cattle pasture that belonged to some farmer whose name I can't remember anymore. That particular afternoon was warm, not hot, but pleasant enough that I'd been outside since breakfast. My grandpa had gone into town for supplies, and Grandma was inside making a pie or something. I had the whole outdoors to myself, which was exactly how I liked it. I'd been hanging around the boathouse pier for a couple hours, messing with this old frog gig my grandpa had given me, and occasionally casting my fishing line into the water. I wasn't catching anything. Honestly, I wasn't really trying that hard. I was just enjoying being outside, watching dragonflies skim across the water and listening to all the spring peepers making noise along the shoreline. The sun felt good on my face, and I remember thinking how perfect everything was at that moment. I was sitting there, dangling my feet off the pier, when I noticed movement at the edge of the swamp. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just a deer coming down for water. We saw them all the time, but then something emerged from the tree line that made my whole body go cold. From the patch of trees right below the pasture fence, this thing stepped out into the water. My first thought was, bear, because what else could be that big? But immediately I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't walk upright like that, not for more than a few seconds anyway. This thing was walking on two legs, completely vertical, and with a confidence that made my stomach drop. I froze completely. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. It was like my brain just shut down everything except my eyes, which were locked onto this creature. It was huge. I mean, seriously massive. Later, when I tried to estimate, I figured it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9. It had these impossibly broad shoulders, like a football player wearing pads, except there were no pads. Just a massive frame covered in dark black hair. The weirdest thing about it was its head, or rather how its head sat directly on its shoulders. There wasn't really a neck that I could see, just this round head positioned right on top of this massive body. The hair, or fur I guess, looked thick and shaggy, especially around the shoulders and back. The thing stood there in knee-deep water, completely still for a moment. Then it looked left, then right, like it was checking if anyone was watching. I was probably a couple 100 yards away, and I don't think it noticed me at first. I was just this small kid sitting motionless on a distant pier. What it did next was so bizarre that I've spent decades trying to make sense of it. It bent at the waist, leaning forward, and then used its left arm, which was incredibly long and thick, to make this sweeping motion through the water. Not like it was trying to grab something, but more like it was deliberately trying to make a splash or disturb the water somehow. The movement created this big wave that rippled outward. After doing this once, it paused, then repeated the exact same motion, bend, sweep, splash. Then it straightened up to its full height again. That's when it turned and looked directly at me. I can't even begin to describe what that felt like. Have you ever had a moment where you feel completely exposed and vulnerable, like every cell in your body is screaming at you to run, but you physically can't? That's what it was like. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel it watching me. I just knew its eyes were locked on mine, but it didn't charge at me or make any threatening moves. It just looked. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, with this calm, deliberate movement, it turned away and walked back into the trees at the edge of the swamp. Not running, not hurrying, just this smooth, purposeful stride that no human could ever mimic. I sat there, unable to move, my fishing rod forgotten beside me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run back to the cabin, but I was terrified that any movement might draw its attention again. So I just sat, barely breathing, watching the spot where it had disappeared. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes passed, enough time that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, when it reappeared in almost the exact same spot. This time, I wasn't shocked like before. The fear was replaced by a fascination I couldn't explain. It walked out to the same place in the water, bent at the waist again, and did that same sweeping motion with its arm. Splash, pause, repeat. Then it straightened up. Again, it looked in my direction. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me specifically or just in the general direction of the cabin and pier. But this time, I had the strangest feeling that it knew I was watching, and that it was okay with that, like we had some kind of unspoken understanding. Just like before, it turned and walked back into the vegetation, disappearing from sight. I kept watching, barely blinking, for almost an hour afterward. My legs had gone numb from sitting in the same position for so long, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It never came back out. One detail I didn't register at the time, but remembered later, was that there were no cows in the pasture across the slough. Usually, you could see at least a few of them grazing, but that day, the pasture was completely empty. I wonder now if they sensed something was there and stayed away. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the cabin, my grandma asked why I looked so pale. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone for years. About 2 weeks later, I was flipping through the local newspaper my grandpa had brought in, and there was this small article about some large, human-like footprints someone had found in the area, not far from our cabin. I nearly choked on my cereal when I read it, but I still kept quiet. Who would believe a 13-year-old kid claiming he saw Bigfoot playing in the swamp? I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that day. What was it doing with that sweeping motion in the water? Was it fishing? Trying to scare fish into shallower water, maybe? Was it some kind of territorial display, or something else entirely that I can't even guess at? I've read about people finding fish placed on logs or rocks near water where Bigfoot sightings have occurred, so maybe it was harvesting food somehow. The strangest part of the whole experience was that I never felt threatened. Terrified, yes, but not because the creature seemed aggressive. It was just the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that turned everything I thought I knew about the world upside down. My grandparents sold that property in the mid-90s after they got too old to maintain it. I went back once, years later, just to see the place again. The new owners had renovated the cabin and rebuilt the pier, but the swamp looked exactly the same. I stood there, looking out at that patch of trees where it had emerged, half hoping I might catch another glimpse. I never did. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods or near water, I get this prickling sensation at the back of my neck, this feeling of being watched. It's probably just my imagination, my brain replaying that afternoon at Elk Creek. But part of me wonders if there are more of those creatures out there, going about their lives just beyond our awareness. I'm 58 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it since. I've gone hiking and camping countless times, always with one eye on the tree line, always listening for heavy footsteps or unusual splashing. Nothing. Just that one incredible afternoon when I was 13. Over the years, I've read about other Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, trying to find something similar to what I experienced. Some accounts come close, the height, the broad shoulders, the dark hair, but I've never found another story about one sweeping its arm through water like that. Maybe what I saw was unique behavior. Maybe it was just a juvenile playing. I don't know. The memory has this strange quality now. It's simultaneously crystal clear and dreamlike. I can picture every detail of how it moved, how the water splashed around its legs, how smoothly it walked despite its massive size. But there's also this surreal feeling, like maybe I fell asleep on that pier and dreamed the whole thing. Except I know I didn't. I've told exactly 3 people about this in my entire life. My wife, who listens without judgment, but I can tell doesn't really believe it. My oldest friend, who just laughed and asked what I'd been drinking that day. And my own son, when he was about 13 himself and we were camping. He's the only one who seemed to really listen, to consider that maybe, just maybe, his old man wasn't making it up. The world feels different when you've seen something like that. Something that challenges everything you've been taught about what is and isn't possible. You start noticing details more. You pay attention to weird stories instead of dismissing them. You find yourself pausing in the woods, listening harder, looking deeper into shadows. One thing I've never done is try to go back and find it. I've had opportunities over the years, but something has always held me back. Maybe it's respect. That creature wasn't bothering anybody. It was just living its life in that swamp, doing whatever it was doing with that strange water-sweeping behavior. Who am I to intrude on that? Or maybe I'm just scared, not of the creature itself, but of facing the possibility that I won't find anything, that there will be no evidence, no confirmation. Sometimes I think it's better to live with the certainty of what I saw than to search and find nothing. That spring day in 1978 changed me in ways I'm still figuring out. Not in any dramatic movie of the week kind of way, just in how I see the world, how I evaluate what's possible. I became more open-minded, more willing to listen to experiences that fall outside the norm. The most frustrating part is not being able to explain it. I've tried researching, reading books about unusual wildlife, even following some of those Bigfoot researchers online. Nothing quite fits what I saw. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hiding. It was just existing, doing its thing in the water without a care in the world, at least until it noticed me watching. I've wondered over the years if it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Did it go back to wherever it lived and try to explain the scrawny human kid it had spotted on the pier? Did it warn others of its kind to be more careful around that area? Or was seeing humans so common that it barely registered? These are the questions that still bounce around in my head decades later. I don't expect answers anymore. I've made peace with the mystery of it. But I still find myself looking out windows at dusk, scanning the edges of ponds and streams when I'm out walking, holding my breath when I hear unusual sounds in the woods. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you never stop looking for it again. And you never quite shake the feeling that somewhere out there it might be looking for you too. Story 8. I've always considered myself a rational person. 20+ years in the Marine Corps will do that to you. Train you to observe, analyze, and make decisions based on facts, not imagination. I served in Vietnam, saw things that would turn most people's stomachs, but nothing in my military career prepared me for what I saw that morning in June 1998. I was staying at my buddy Mike's cabin on one of those picturesque lakes in northern Arkansas. We'd been fishing those waters for over a decade, and I knew every inch of that shoreline. Mike had inherited the place from his uncle. Nothing fancy, just a 2-story wooden structure with the basics, but the location was perfect for base fishing. We'd arrived the previous evening, planning to get an early start the next morning. That day started like any other fishing trip. I woke up before sunrise, around 5:30. Mike was still snoring in the other room. The cabin had this upstairs bedroom with a large window facing the lake and surrounding woods. I remember standing there, sipping my coffee, watching the fog hover over the water as the first hints of sunlight started breaking through the trees. I was mentally planning our day, which spots we'd hit first, what lures to try, when movement at the edge of the tree line caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd seen plenty of black bears in that area over the years, but something felt off about the way it moved. This thing was walking upright. Not just upright for a moment like bears sometimes do, but consistently, purposefully moving on 2 legs. As it emerged more clearly from the trees, I felt the coffee mug slip from my fingers and shatter on the floor. I didn't even react to the hot liquid splashing on my feet. It was about 7 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in thick, grayish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear, but longer, coarser hair that hung from its body. The color wasn't uniform. It had darker patches across the shoulders and lighter areas on its chest. Its arms were massive, hanging lower than a human's would, swinging slightly as it moved. The creature was moving at a steady trot along the edge of the trees, not running, but definitely covering ground quickly. What struck me most was how powerful it looked. Broad shoulders, thick neck, a massive frame that somehow still moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I've spent my entire adult life observing terrain, assessing situations and judging distances accurately. Military training ingrained that in me. This thing was real, solid, and unlike anything I'd ever seen in those woods. It had a slightly hunched posture, but it wasn't awkward or unnatural, more like the stance of something perfectly adapted to moving through that environment. As it moved through a denser patch of trees, it didn't duck or weave around branches like a human would. Small trees and limbs just bent and swayed as it pushed through them. I remember thinking, that would take immense strength. The vegetation parted around it like water around the bow of a boat. The creature moved from the wooded area onto the earth dam that separates part of the shoreline from the main body of the lake. That's when I got my clearest view. In the open, with nothing obscuring my line of sight, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. This wasn't a man in a costume, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could rationally explain. The musculature was visible even under the hair. The shoulders rolled with each movement, the thighs flexed with each step. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders with barely any visible neck, and it had what I can only describe as a sagittal crest, a ridge running along the top of the skull. I estimated the entire sighting lasted maybe 8 seconds from first glimpse to when it disappeared across the far side of the dam. But those seconds are burned into my memory with perfect clarity. I didn't see its face clearly. It was moving perpendicular to my position and never turned toward the cabin. But the profile was unmistakably primate-like, with a pronounced brow ridge and a flat nose. My first thought after it disappeared was that someone must be playing a prank. Mike was the obvious suspect. We'd been known to mess with each other on these trips. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The cabin door slammed against the wall as I burst outside, scanning the area where I'd seen the creature. Nothing. No movement, no sound out of the ordinary. Just the early morning calls of birds and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I looked toward the dock and saw Mike already there, his back to me, preparing our boat for the day. He was at least 200 yards away from where I'd seen the creature and in the opposite direction. "Mike!" I shouted, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. He turned, squinting at me in the morning light. "What's got you all worked up? Thought you were getting the tackle ready?" In that moment, I knew it couldn't have been him. There was no way he could have been wearing a costume one minute and then be down at the dock the next, already dressed in his fishing clothes with the boat partially loaded. Besides, Mike was 5'10" and stocky. The thing I'd seen was massive, with proportions no costume could replicate. I jogged down to the dock, my mind racing. Should I tell him? Would he think I was crazy or had been hitting the whiskey too early? I've always prided myself on my reliability, my steady nature. In the Corps, they called me Rock because nothing rattled me. But this had me shaken to my core. "You okay, Tom? You look like you've seen a ghost," Mike said, handing me a life vest. "I saw something up there." I pointed toward the tree line and dam, moving through the woods. "Bear?" Mike asked, barely interested as he checked the outboard motor. "No, bigger, walking on 2 legs." That got his attention. He straightened up and looked at me, trying to decide if I was messing with him. "I'm serious, Mike. It was moving upright, covered in hair. Never seen anything like it. Someone hiking, maybe. Hunters come through here sometimes." I shook my head. It wasn't human, too big, too different. The way it moved through those trees. A person would have been fighting through those branches, but this thing just pushed through like they were nothing. Mike stared at me for a long moment. We'd known each other since we were stationed together in '72. He knew I wasn't prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. "You're talking about a Sasquatch," he said finally. Not a question, a statement. The word hung in the air between us. I'd never been one for cryptid stories or paranormal nonsense. I'd rolled my eyes at supposed Sasquatch sightings on late-night TV shows, but standing there with the image of what I'd seen still fresh in my mind, I couldn't deny it. "I guess I am," I admitted. Mike didn't laugh or dismiss it. "That's one of the reasons we'd remained friends for so long. Let's get the boat ready, and you can show me exactly where you saw it." We spent the next hour searching the area. The earth dam where I'd seen it cross had some depressions in the soft ground that could have been footprints, but nothing clear enough to be conclusive. The underbrush along the tree line was disturbed, branches broken at a height of about 7 feet, consistent with something tall moving through, but again, nothing that couldn't be explained by other means. "Think about calling anyone about this? Fish and Wildlife, maybe?" Mike suggested as we finally got on the water. I considered it briefly. "And tell them what? That a retired Marine with no history of mental issues or substance abuse saw a Sasquatch? They'd write it off as a bear sighting by someone who doesn't know better." The frustrating thing was, I did know better. I'd spent my entire adult life in wilderness environments across the globe. I knew the difference between a bear and whatever this was. My eyes are better than 20/20 even in my 50s. It's why I was such a good marksman. I know what I saw. We tried fishing that day, but my heart wasn't in it. My eyes kept drifting to the shoreline, scanning the trees. The excitement of landing a 4-pound bass barely registered. My mind kept replaying those 8 seconds over and over. That evening, back at the cabin, I drew what I'd seen as best I could. I'm no artist, but the proportions were important to capture. Mike compared it to reported Sasquatch descriptions. The height, the conical head, the lack of a distinct neck, the long arms. The similarities were undeniable. "You know what's strange?" I said as we sat on the deck watching the sunset. "I wasn't afraid when I saw it. Shocked, yes, but not scared. It wasn't behaving aggressively, it was just traveling, like it had somewhere to be." "You think it knew you were watching?" Mike asked. That question had been nagging at me all day. "I don't think so. It never looked toward the cabin, but who knows? Maybe it was aware and just didn't care." We stayed 3 more days at the cabin. I got up at the same time each morning, stood at that same window hoping for another glimpse. Nothing. We explored the area where I'd seen it, looking for hair, footprints, anything. We found a few broken branches high up, but nothing conclusive. I've been back to that lake many times since 1998. Never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it. But then I remember the details. The way muscles moved under that coarse hair. The specific grayish-brown coloration with those darker patches. The slight steam rising from its body in the cool morning air. Those aren't details imagination creates. Those are things you observe. I've told this story exactly 3 times in 23 years. Most people react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. A few ask if I'd been drinking. I hadn't even started my second cup of coffee. One person suggested I'd seen another fisherman in heavy clothing. But fishermen don't stand 7 feet tall with proportions that defy human anatomy, and they certainly don't push through thick brush that would stop a normal man in his tracks. I know what I saw that morning. Military training teaches you to trust your observations, especially when you've had time to observe and assess. 6 to 10 seconds isn't long, but it was long enough for someone with my background to recognize that what I was seeing wasn't normal. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm not on some mission to prove Sasquatch exists. I'm simply reporting what I saw with the same accuracy I'd have used to report enemy movements in a combat situation. The facts are what they are. That morning in northern Arkansas, I saw a creature that mainstream science says doesn't exist. It moved with purpose and power through terrain that would challenge the average human. It displayed physical characteristics consistent with what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I don't know what it was doing there or where it was going. I don't know if it lives in those woods permanently or was just passing through. All I know is what I saw, and what I saw was real. Sometimes at night, I still hear the sound of those branches bending and swaying as something massive moved through them. I still see that distinctive silhouette against the morning mist, and I wonder if it's still out there, moving through those Arkansas woods when no one's watching. Or maybe someone is watching right now, standing at their window with a coffee mug slipping from their fingers, experiencing those few seconds that will change how they see the world forever. Story 9. I've never shared this publicly before. I'm not the type of person who goes looking for attention or makes up stories for kicks. I'm just a regular guy who's been snowmobiling in the Idaho backcountry for most of my life. What happened to me in January 2010 outside McCall changed everything I thought I knew about those mountains I've been riding through for over 2 decades. I'd planned a 3-day solo trip through some of my favorite routes in the Payette National Forest. Nothing unusual about that. I'd done similar trips dozens of times before. I packed my usual gear: emergency supplies, extra fuel, food for a few days, sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temps, the works. The forecast called for some light snow on day 2, but nothing serious. Anyone who's spent time in Idaho winters knows forecasts are more like suggestions than promises. I set out early that morning, around 6 a.m. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, typical for January up there. The first several hours went exactly as planned. Pristine trails, incredible mountain views, that feeling of absolute freedom you can only get when it's just you and the machine against the wilderness. By early afternoon, I was deep into the backcountry, probably about 25 miles from the nearest plowed road. That's when the weather turned, not gradually either. Within an hour, I went from clear visibility to what I'd call near whiteout conditions. The snow wasn't just falling, it was dumping. The wind picked up too, blowing snow sideways across my visor. I knew immediately I needed to change plans. Pushing forward would have been stupid, and heading back would mean hours riding against worsening conditions. I remembered a small Forest Service cabin about 3 miles off my planned route, nestled in a thick stand of pines near Hayes Creek. It wasn't much, basically a one-room shelter with a wood stove, but it would keep me alive through the night. These emergency cabins dot the backcountry throughout Idaho, some maintained better than others. I'd stayed in this particular one maybe 2 or 3 times over the years. By the time I reached the cabin, around 4 in the afternoon, visibility was down to maybe 15 feet. The temperature had dropped to single digits, and the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the trees surrounding the clearing. The cabin itself looked exactly as I remembered: weathered logs with a metal roof, a single window beside the door, sitting about 30 yards back from the frozen creek. I parked my sled under the small firewood lean-to attached to one side of the cabin, grabbed my gear, and got inside as quickly as possible. The interior was basic: dirt floor, raised sleeping platform along one wall, small table with a single chair, and a cast-iron wood stove that had probably been there since the 70s. It smelled musty, but not terrible. No signs of mice or other critters had moved in, which was a relief. First priority was getting a fire going. The service usually keeps some dry wood stacked inside these cabins, and luckily there was enough to last the night. I got the stove fired up, hung my outer gear to dry, and set up my sleeping bag on the platform. There's something oddly peaceful about being sheltered during a serious storm, that contrast between the chaos outside and the small pocket of safety you've created. I heated some food I'd packed, melted snow for water, and settled in. By 9 p.m., the storm was still raging. Wind howled through the trees, occasionally gusting hard enough to send snow sliding off the metal roof with a whoosh. I checked my sled one last time before turning in, making sure it was secured and covered as best as possible. The temperature outside had dropped to negative territory. Inside, with the stove glowing red, it was probably 50 degrees. Not comfortable, but survivable. I drifted off to sleep around 10, planning to head out at first light if the storm let up. At roughly 1:30 in the morning, I jolted awake. Something had pulled me from a dead sleep. I lay still for a moment, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me. The fire had died down, leaving the cabin dim except for the dull orange glow from the stove. The wind had eased considerably, and the silence outside was almost complete. Then I heard it. It's difficult to describe this sound accurately. It started as something like a high-pitched scream. My first thought was mountain lion, but almost immediately I knew that wasn't right. It lasted too long, a full 15 or 20 seconds without break. And beneath the screaming quality was this incredible depth, like there was a second, lower tone underlying it. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the mountains across the valley. It sounded far away, maybe half a mile down the creek. I've heard all kinds of animal sounds in these mountains. Elk bugling, wolves howling, mountain lions screaming, bears roaring. This wasn't any of those, not even close. I got up and added wood to the stove, more for something to do than anything else. My heart was hammering. I checked my watch, 1:37 a.m. Then I just stood there listening. The snow had nearly stopped falling, and the clouds had broken somewhat, allowing patches of moonlight to filter through. Outside the single window, I could see the clearing in front of the cabin, illuminated in that bluish winter moonlight. Beyond that, the wall of dark timber. About 5 minutes passed in silence. I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamed the whole thing when it came again. Same sound, that high scream with the deeper undertone, but closer, much closer, maybe a quarter mile away now. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. The sound itself was unnerving enough. But there was something else about it that bothered me even more. It felt deliberate, like a signal or a call, not just an animal cry. I checked that the door was securely latched. These cabins aren't exactly fortresses, just basic log structures with simple doors. But it was better than nothing. I considered my options. My sled was right outside, but trying to ride out in the dark, in these conditions, with whatever was making that sound out there, that seemed like a worse option than staying put. The minutes dragged by. I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside. The fire popped and hissed in the stove. Wind occasionally rustled through the pine boughs, and then I heard it, crunching footsteps in the snow. Heavy ones. The snow was deep, probably 3 feet of fresh powder on top of the existing snowpack. Whatever was making those footsteps was big and heavy enough to punch through that depth with each step. And the spacing was wrong. Too far apart for a person. Way too far apart. The steps circled slowly around the cabin, keeping to the tree line about 20 yards out. I could track the movement just by sound, from the front around to the side where my sled was parked, to the back of the cabin, then to the other side, and back to the front again. One complete circle took maybe 5 minutes. Deliberate, careful, like it was examining the structure from every angle. After the second circle, it stopped somewhere near the front corner of the cabin. Then silence, complete silence for at least 10 minutes. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, barely breathing, straining to hear any indication of where it had gone. The scream came so suddenly and so close that I physically jumped backward. It was right outside. Couldn't have been more than 15 feet from the door. The sound was deafening, rattling the single window and vibrating through the logs of the cabin. It didn't fade away like you'd expect if something were moving or running off. It just held, sustained at the same volume and intensity for what felt like forever, but was probably 20 seconds. Then it cut off abruptly. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It was like a siren, but organic. Powerful beyond anything an animal should be capable of producing. It echoed down the valley, bouncing back from the peaks across the creek. After it stopped, the footsteps resumed. Slower now, circling again, but closer to the cabin, maybe 10 yards out from the walls. I could hear the snow compacting with each heavy step, At one point, something scraped against the logs on the back wall. Not a knock or a bang, just a brushing sound like something running its hand or paw along the surface. This continued for hours, periods of circling, followed by long stretches of silence, punctuated by those horrifying screams. Sometimes it would move farther away, its footsteps fading into the trees, only to return 20 or 30 minutes later from a different direction. Around 4 in the morning, during one of the quiet periods, I heard heavy breathing outside the window. Not panting like a dog or wolf, deeper, slower breaths. Something large, standing still, just on the other side of that single pane of glass. I couldn't see anything, just darkness, but I could hear it breathing, in, out, controlled and deliberate. I didn't move a muscle, didn't even blink. Just stood there, staring at that window, waiting for something to appear. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the breathing moved away, and the footsteps resumed their circling pattern. As the night dragged on, I became aware of the patterns in this thing's behavior. It wasn't random. It wasn't just some animal wandering around. It was studying the cabin, testing it, watching for reactions. There was intelligence behind its movements. By 5:30 a.m., I could see the first faint hints of dawn through the window. The footsteps had stopped about 20 minutes earlier, and there'd been no screams for at least an hour. I waited another half hour, until there was enough light to see clearly, before I even considered going outside. At first light, around 6:15, I finally gathered the courage to open the door. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, scanning the tree line, looking for any movement, any sign of what had been stalking the cabin all night. The forest was silent except for the occasional chunk of snow falling from overloaded branches. Eventually, I stepped out. The air was crystal clear and bitterly cold, probably negative 10 or 15. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind that intense winter stillness you only feel after heavy snowfall. Everything was covered in pristine white powder, unmarked except for, about 20 yards from the door, leading toward the creek, was a line of depressions in the snow. Not tracks exactly, the fresh powder was too deep for that, but massive impressions where something heavy had pushed through. They were spaced about 6 feet apart, an impossible stride length for a human. Each depression was roughly oval-shaped, much larger than my boot. What really got me were the drag marks between them, like whatever made them was so tall and powerful that it was actually dragging its feet through the deep snow rather than lifting them completely out with each step. I followed the impressions with my eyes to where they disappeared into the thick stand of pines that lined the creek. I didn't follow them physically. I'm not that stupid. Instead, I quickly packed up my gear, got my sled ready, and was on my way within 15 minutes. I've never moved so fast breaking camp in my life. The entire ride back to town, I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced something was following me. Nothing was, as far as I could tell, but that feeling of being watched stayed with me for days afterward. I've spent 20 years riding those mountains. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, wolves, all the predators Idaho has to offer. Nothing has ever behaved like what I experienced that night. No known animal circles a structure repeatedly for hours. No known animal in those mountains makes sounds like what I heard. What stayed with me most isn't just the screams or the tracks. It's the clear evidence of intelligence, the methodical circling, the strategic approaches and retreats, the long periods of silence that seemed designed to make me wonder where it had gone. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was something watching, thinking, and testing. I've gone back to riding in those mountains since then, but never alone, and never in that particular area again. I've also never stayed overnight in a remote cabin since. Some lessons you only need to learn once. I haven't told many people this story. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But I know what I heard and saw that night outside McCall. And I know there's something in those mountains that isn't supposed to exist. Something that watches and waits and screams like a siren in the night. Story 10. I've been a farmer in Coos Bay for most of my adult life. Just outside town, my property isn't huge, but it's mine, and I've never had any trouble with it. 23 years I've lived here, working this land, tending my small herd of cattle, living a quiet life with my dogs. I'm not one for tall tales or ghost stories. I deal in facts, weather patterns, soil conditions, market prices, practical things. What happened last November changed all that. I still don't have a name for what visited my property. I don't like putting labels on things I don't understand. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what it left behind. It was the second week of November 1996. We'd had a streak of clear, cold nights, unusual for Oregon coast that time of year. I remember because the clarity had me spending more time than usual just looking at the stars before bed. The night it started was a Tuesday. I turned in around 10 like I usually do. My bedroom window faces the barn, an old weathered red structure about 50 yards from the house. It's been there longer than I have, solid built with heavy sliding doors. I was deep asleep when something jolted me awake. The bedside clock read 2:03 a.m. At first I thought it was just the dogs, but they were still asleep at the foot of my bed. Then I heard it again, a distinct thud from the direction of the barn. Not the sound of a branch falling, which was my first thought. This was more deliberate, like something solid hitting wood. I sat up, fully awake now. The dogs stirred but didn't bark, which struck me as odd. Outside, the night was dead still. No wind, no rain, nothing that would explain the noise. I was about to lie back down, convince myself it was nothing, when I heard the second thud, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of the barn door rattling on its hinges, like somebody or something was trying to get in. I keep a yard light on at night, one of those dusk to dawn things. It doesn't light up the whole property, but it casts enough glow to see the outline of the barn. I got up and went to the window, squinting into the dim light. For a moment, nothing moved. Then I saw it, a shadow moving across the side of the barn, not small like a raccoon or possum, big, bigger than any animal that should be on my property. It moved with purpose, then disappeared around the back of the structure. I stood frozen at that window, not sure what to do. Call the sheriff. For what? A shadow. I thought about grabbing my shotgun and heading out there, but something held me back. Some instinct I couldn't name. So I waited, watching. Nothing else happened, no more thuds, no more movement. After half an hour, I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much. Morning came, and I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. But after finishing my coffee, I walked out to check the barn. What I found made my stomach drop. The heavy sliding door had deep, vertical scratches high up on the outer planks, way higher than my cattle could reach, at least 7 feet off the ground. The metal latch was slightly bent, like someone had pulled on it, hard. And caught in the gaps between the wooden panels were muddy smudges with dark hair embedded in them, coarse, long hair that didn't belong to any of my animals. My first thought was a bear, though we don't get many around here. But the more I looked, the less that made sense. Several boards were broken near the top of the door, almost 7 feet high. Inside, one of the heavy metal feed barrels was dented on one side and thrown about 10 feet from where I keep it. A bear would have just knocked it over to get at the contents, not thrown it. I walked the perimeter of the barn looking for more clues, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, not bear prints, not cow prints. They looked almost human, but they were huge, 15 inches long at least, and flat with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was incredible, more than 6 feet apart. Whatever made these prints was big, heavy, and walked on 2 legs. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've faced down angry bulls, weathered storms that threatened to tear my roof off, even chased armed trespassers off my land once. But standing there, looking at those prints, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. a cold, primal fear that crawled up my spine and settled in the base of my skull. I spent the day fixing the damage to the barn, reinforcing the door as best I could, and trying to come up with rational explanations for what I'd found. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself it was just some weird coincidence, maybe a bear combined with wind damage I hadn't noticed before. The mind plays tricks when you're alone too much. That night, I went to bed with my shotgun propped against the wall just in case. I dozed off eventually, but woke suddenly at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of my dogs going absolutely berserk. Not their usual barking at raccoons or deer. This was frantic, terrified barking that made the hair on my arms stand up. I got to the window in time to see it, a large, dark figure moving behind the barn. It was upright, walking on two legs, with wide shoulders that seemed to roll with each step. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, disappearing into the tree line that borders my property to the east. What the hell? I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the window glass. The dogs were still barking, but they wouldn't go near the door. These are farm dogs. They'll chase anything. But something about this had them terrified. I didn't sleep again that night, just sat in my chair by the window, shotgun across my lap, watching and waiting. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was knew I was watching, that it was watching back. The next day, I found more damage. Another board broken on the barn, some feed scattered around, not eaten, just thrown about. And more footprints, deeper this time, like the thing had been carrying something heavy. This pattern continued for almost a week, always the same. Activity starting after 2 a.m., knocking sounds, heavy footsteps. One night I swear I heard breathing outside my bedroom window, deep and rhythmic, but when I got up to look there was nothing there. Just those same massive footprints in the soft soil beneath my window the next morning. I reinforced my barn doors with extra boards and added more locks. I got a stronger yard light and set up a motion detector. I even called an old buddy who works for the Forestry Service to ask about unusual wildlife sightings. He laughed and asked if I'd been drinking. "Tom," he said, "there's nothing in those woods bigger than a black bear, and they don't walk upright for extended periods or throw metal barrels around." I didn't tell him about the footprints. Didn't tell anyone, really. What was I supposed to say? That Bigfoot was trying to break into my barn. I'd be the laughingstock of Coos Bay, but I knew what I'd seen wasn't a bear. Wasn't a man either. On the 6th night, things escalated. The knocking at the barn became pounding, so loud it echoed across my property. I grabbed my shotgun and, against my better judgment, went onto the porch. The motion light I'd installed flared to life, and for a split second I saw it clearly. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. The breadth of its shoulders was almost comical, like a linebacker in a fur coat. But what struck me most were its eyes catching the light, not glowing like a deer's, but reflecting it in a way that was unsettlingly intelligent. It was standing beside my barn, one massive hand pressed against the wall, looking directly at me. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I had the shotgun halfway raised, but something stopped me from lifting it further. There was an awareness in those eyes. Not animal, not quite human, but something in between. Something that understood what the gun meant. It made a sound then, not a growl, more like a deep exhalation, and then it simply turned and walked into the trees. Not running, not afraid, just leaving. The visit stopped after that night. No more pounding, no more footprints, nothing disturbed or broken. It was like whatever had been visiting had satisfied its curiosity. Or maybe I had satisfied its need to be seen, to be acknowledged. I still reinforced the barn locks and kept the motion lights though. Some precautions are just good sense. I never labeled what visited my property that week. Never called it a Bigfoot or Sasquatch out loud, though the words certainly crossed my mind. I just know it wasn't a bear and it wasn't a man. It's been months now, and sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Then I look at the claw marks still visible on my barn door, the dents in the feed barrel I couldn't bring myself to replace. I think about those intelligent eyes reflecting my porch light. I don't go out after dark much anymore, especially not toward the tree line. Not because I'm afraid exactly, it's more like respect. For 6 nights, something claimed my property as part of its territory. Something that could have hurt me if it wanted to, but didn't. Something that I believe just wanted to be known. The coast of Oregon holds more secrets than people realize. Most folks stick to the beaches, the towns, the well-traveled roads. They don't venture into the dense forests that press right up against civilization. They don't listen to the sounds at night that can't be explained away. I listen now. Every night around 2 a.m., I still wake up, part of me expecting to hear that thud against the barn. I never do, but I listen anyway. And sometimes, on very still nights when the fog rolls in from the coast, I swear I can hear something moving through the trees at the edge of my property. Something big that walks upright. Something watching. I don't tell this story often. People either think you're crazy, or they turn it into some kind of campfire tale, missing the point entirely. The point isn't that there are monsters in the woods. The point is that there are things in this world that don't fit into the neat categories we've created. Things that exist in the in-between spaces that occasionally cross over into our world for reasons we can't understand. I still farm this land, still tend my cattle, still live my quiet life. But I know now that I share this space with something else. Something that has as much right to be here as I do. Maybe more. And on dark nights when I can't sleep, I sometimes stand at my window and look out toward the tree line, wondering if it's out there, looking back, wondering if it remembers the farmer who didn't shoot, who didn't call in hunters or researchers, who just let it be what it is. I hope it does. I hope it knows not all men are a threat. Because I know now, not all monsters are either. Story 11. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been eating at me for decades now. Back in 1993, I worked as an alarm camera monitor at a high-security nuclear storage facility in upstate New York. Not going to name the exact location for obvious reasons. My job was pretty straightforward. I monitored surveillance feeds from a 75-foot tower. I operated cameras manually when needed, but they also triggered automatically whenever security alarms went off. I'd been doing the job for about 3 years at that point, and honestly, it was usually boring as hell. Most nights I'd just sit there watching nothing happen for 8 hours straight. The most excitement we typically got was when a deer wandered too close to the perimeter fence. That all changed on October 12th, 1993. I was working the midnight shift, which I actually preferred because it was even quieter than days. Less brass around to micromanage. The facility was massive, acres of concrete, chain-link fencing topped with 3 strands of barbed wire, all of it surrounding buildings that housed God knows what. We weren't privy to exactly what was stored there, just told it was nuclear materials, and that security was paramount. It was about 1:15 in the morning when the first ground alarm triggered. This wasn't unusual. We got false alarms from time to time, especially on windy nights or when wildlife got too close. The system automatically swiveled the nearest camera to the alarm location, which was Sector 7B, along the eastern perimeter fence. I expected to see a deer or maybe a coyote. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. There, standing next to our 8-foot security fence was something huge, something that shouldn't exist. It was a massive, hairy humanoid creature standing easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had broad shoulders covered in dark brown or black hair, not fur like an animal, but longer hair. The face was partially visible in the infrared lighting, a flat, wide nose, deep-set eyes, and a pronounced brow ridge. and it was looking directly up at the camera, directly at me. I've never felt anything like that moment. It wasn't just seeing something impossible, it was the way it looked at the camera. It knew it was being watched. There was intelligence in those eyes. I'm not a man who scares easily. I'd been in the military before this job, served in Desert Storm, but this paralyzed me for a good 5 seconds. Then my training kicked in. I hit the radio and called in a Code 3 security response. We had armed patrols that circulated the perimeter 24/7, and the nearest one was only about 2 minutes away from that location. Security Tower to Mobile Unit 3. I have a perimeter breach attempt in Sector 7B, East Fence Line. 4-man team requested immediately. They responded right away. Mobile 3 to Tower, copy that. ETA 2 minutes to Sector 7B. While waiting for them to arrive, I kept my eyes glued to that monitor. The creature didn't move much. It just stood there, occasionally glancing around, but mostly staring up at the camera. It seemed to be assessing the fence, looking up and down its length. I zoomed in as much as I could. Its features became clearer. Definitely not a man in a suit. The proportions were all wrong. The arms hung down almost to its knees. The shoulders were impossibly broad. I radioed again. Mobile 3, be advised. We have an unknown subject at the fence line. Appears to be... I hesitated. What the hell was I supposed to say? Appears to be a very large individual. Exercise extreme caution. Mobile 3 acknowledged, and about 90 seconds later, I saw their vehicle lights approaching on the perimeter road. This is where things got weird. Like, beyond weird. I could see both the patrol vehicle and the creature in the same camera frame. The creature turned its head to look toward the approaching headlights, but didn't run. It just stood there. The patrol vehicle pulled up about 30 yards from where this thing was standing and stopped. 4 armed security officers got out, flashlights scanning the area. Mobile 3 to Tower, we're on site at Sector 7B. What's the exact location of your subject? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's right there, directly in front of you, standing by the fence. There was a pause. Tower, we don't see anyone at the fence line. Are you sure about the location? I was watching the camera feed in disbelief. The 4 officers were standing maybe 20 feet away from this enormous creature, shining their flashlights right in its general direction, and they couldn't see it. I watched as one of the officers walked directly toward it, scanning his light back and forth. He's right there, 10 feet in front of Officer Jenkins right now. Jenkins stopped, pointing his flashlight exactly where I directed. Tower, there's nothing here. Maybe your infrared is giving you a false reading. I couldn't process what was happening. The creature shifted its weight, looking from the officers back up to the camera. There was almost a smug expression on its face, like it knew they couldn't see it. Hold on, I said, switching the camera from infrared to standard mode, then back again. The creature was visible in both. I'm looking at it right now, 8-foot-tall, hairy humanoid, standing 3 feet from the fence. There was obvious concern in the team leader's voice now. Tower, do you need medical assistance? There is absolutely nothing here matching that description. I felt sick to my stomach. Was I hallucinating? But no, I was watching this thing in real time. It was as real as the guard standing near it. After about 5 more minutes of this bizarre standoff, me seeing something the patrol couldn't see, the creature simply turned and walked away from the fence into the tree line beyond. I tracked it with the camera as far as I could until it disappeared into the thick forest that surrounded the facility. The patrol stayed another 20 minutes, checking the fence line and surrounding area. They found nothing. No footprints, no disturbance to the ground, no evidence that anything had been there at all. When they left, I sat there in shock, replaying the footage. I could still see it clearly, this massive, impossible creature that 4 trained security officers somehow couldn't perceive. I checked the recording system to make sure it had captured everything. The indicator light showed the recording had worked. At least I'd have evidence. When my shift ended at 8 a.m., I filed my report exactly as it happened. I didn't embellish or speculate, just reported the facts. Massive humanoid creature at fence line. Officers unable to see subject despite its clear presence on camera. Subject departed without incident. I drove home in a daze, questioning my own sanity. I'd been working too many night shifts lately. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. But I knew what I'd seen. The recording would back me up. I'd barely been home an hour when my phone rang. It was my Superintendent Garrison. "Reynolds, I need you back at the facility immediately." "Sir, I just completed my shift. This isn't a request. Be here in 30 minutes. Commander Bryce wants to see you." Commander Bryce. He was the head of the entire facility. In 3 years, I'd only seen him twice at staff meetings. A cold dread settled over me. I drove back, sleep forgotten. When I arrived, I was escorted directly to Bryce's office. Inside were Bryce, Superintendent Garrison, and 2 men I'd never seen before. They wore identical black suits, white shirts, no ties. They had close-cropped hair and expressionless faces. They didn't introduce themselves. Bryce wasted no time. "Officer Reynolds, we've reviewed your report from this morning." I nodded. "Yes, sir." "Your report indicates you witnessed an 8-foot humanoid creature at our eastern perimeter fence." "That's correct, sir. I have the footage." "There is no footage," one of the suited men interrupted. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Excuse me." I looked at the man in confusion. I saw the recording light on. The system was functioning properly. The second suited man spoke. "What you think you saw was a deer, a large buck that triggered the ground sensors." My mouth went dry. "Sir, with all due respect, I know what I saw. It wasn't a deer." Commander Bryce leaned forward. "Reynolds, let me be perfectly clear. What you reported never happened. Do you understand?" I stared at him in disbelief. "But sir, never happened." He slid a form across the desk. "You're going to rewrite your report. You're going to state that the alarm was triggered by a deer, and then you're going to sign this non-disclosure agreement." I read the document. It was extensive, threatening everything from immediate termination to federal prosecution if I discussed anything that occurred during my shift. "What is this about?" I asked. "Why are you asking me to lie?" The first suited man stood up. "Officer Reynolds, this facility handles matters of national security. Some things must remain classified. A giant, hairy, man-like creature is a matter of national security." I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. The second man's face tightened. "Sign the papers." Something in his tone made me realize I had no choice. I rewrote my report as instructed and signed the NDA. As I was leaving, Commander Bryce called after me. "Reynolds, this meeting never happened either. Go home, get some sleep, and be back for your shift tonight. Business as usual." I nodded numbly and left, but I couldn't let it go. 2 days later, during a quiet period on my shift, I tried to access the archived footage from that night. The files for those hours were completely missing. Not corrupted, not mislabeled, just gone, as if that time period had never been recorded. The next day, my personal cell phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized. "Officer Reynolds," Commander Bryce's voice came through clearly. "Stop looking for the footage." My blood ran cold. "Sir, I don't. This is your only warning. Never look for it again." He hung up. How did he know? How did he know I had searched for it? Our computer system logged all access attempts, but why would the commander of the entire facility be monitoring my specific activities? And how did he get my personal cell number? I never searched for the footage again. I continued working there for another 2 years before transferring to a different facility. I never saw anything like that creature again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd feel like someone, or something, was watching me from the tree line. I'd zoom the cameras in that direction but never saw anything. For years, I've kept this to myself. The NDA technically still applies, but it's been almost 30 years, and I'm retired now. What are they going to do to me? Besides, people need to know. I've thought about this experience every day since it happened. What was that creature? Why couldn't the patrol see it? And most importantly, why was the government so determined to cover it up? The only conclusion I've been able to reach is that they know about these beings. They've known for a long time. Whatever that thing was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, something else entirely, certain elements within our government are aware of their existence and have been actively suppressing the information. Why? I don't know. Maybe they fear public panic. Maybe there's some kind of agreement or understanding between these creatures and certain officials. Maybe there's something about their nature, like the apparent ability to remain invisible to some people but not others, that has military applications. All I know for certain is what I saw that night. It was real, it was intelligent, and our government wants to keep it secret. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. I've made peace with the fact that most people will dismiss this as the ramblings of an old security guard. But I know what I saw, and now you do too. To this day, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm being watched. I'll look out my bedroom window toward the woods behind my house and wonder, is it out there, and can it see me even if I can't see it? Story 12. I've held this in for over 40 years now. I'm finally getting to a point in my life where I feel comfortable sharing what happened to me, even if most people will think I'm crazy. It was September 1981. I had just turned 18 that summer, fresh out of high school, and still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. My buddy Jeff and I were out cruising around southern Illinois in my beat-up Chevy Nova. It was one of those perfect late summer evenings. Not too hot, not too cold. That golden hour when the sun's getting low, but there's still plenty of light. We'd been friends since elementary school and were just killing time before he left for college, and I started my job at the factory. We were taking the back roads, windows down, radio playing something like REO Speedwagon or Journey. Can't exactly remember now. We were on this rural highway that cuts through farmland and patches of woods. Not a lot of traffic, just us talking about girls and what we were going to do with our lives. Normal 18-year-old stuff. It must have been around 7 in the evening when we came up on this concrete overpass. What caught my attention wasn't the bridge itself, but the cluster of people standing on it. There were maybe 10 folks gathered along the railing, all looking down at something below. They seemed focused, like they were watching something important. "What do you think's going on?" Jeff asked. I shrugged. "Car accident, maybe? Let's check it out." I pulled my car onto the gravel shoulder about 50 feet from the overpass. We got out and walked over to where everyone was standing. It was a mix of people, a couple of older guys in trucker caps, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, some teenagers, and a few others I don't remember as clearly now. They all had this same expression, part confusion, part fascination. As we approached, nobody even acknowledged us. They were all too fixated on whatever was happening below. When we got to the railing and looked down, I saw a creek winding through a small wooded area. The banks were muddy with some rocks scattered around, and the water wasn't moving very fast. Pretty typical for that area. Then I spotted what everyone was staring at, and my whole world shifted. About 30 yards downstream from the bridge, crouched at the water's edge, was what I first thought was a gorilla. It was hunched down, using its massive hands to splash around in the water like it was trying to catch fish or find something. The creature's back was to us, and from that angle, with its dark hair and the way it was moving, escaped zoo animal was honestly my first thought. "Holy shit," I whispered to Jeff. "Is that a gorilla?" An older gentleman standing next to me, must have been in his 60s, wearing overalls and a faded John Deere cap, shook his head without taking his eyes off the creature. "Ain't no gorilla, son," he said quietly. "Some kind of ape, maybe, but no gorilla I ever seen looked like that." The woman in the floral dress leaned toward us. "Might be that Momo," she said, her voice tense. "Been reports all over the radio around St. Louis. My cousin's neighbor said they saw something like it last month over in Jefferson County." I'd heard vague stories about Momo, this supposed monster that people claim to have seen around Missouri and Illinois. Always figured it was just local legend, something to scare kids with. But standing there looking at whatever was in that creek, those stories suddenly felt a lot more real. For what seemed like forever, we all just stood there, watching this thing splash around in the water. Nobody moved. Nobody talked much. It was like we were all afraid to break the spell or attract its attention. Then it happened. Someone's car door slammed in the distance, and the sound echoed across the open space. The creature stopped what it was doing. Its massive shoulders tensed. Then slowly it began to turn around. I remember feeling like my feet were cemented to the bridge. Part of me wanted to run, but a stronger part couldn't look away. As the creature turned to face our direction, it gradually stood upright and kept rising and kept rising. I've been to the St. Louis Zoo many times. I've seen gorillas up close. The biggest silverback maybe hits about 5.5, maybe 6 feet when fully standing. This wasn't possible. It had to be 10, maybe 11 feet tall. It towered over the surrounding vegetation. And it wasn't just the height. This thing was massive in every way. The shoulders were twice as wide as any human's. I guess it weighed at least 900 pounds, maybe more. Its hair was this dark brown color, almost black. But what struck me was how it didn't look like the coarse fur you'd see on a bear or even a gorilla. It was almost wavy, with a silky sheen where the evening sun hit it. It covered most of its body, but thinned out around what I could now see was its face. And that face, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly like any ape I'd seen either. The proportions were off. It had a wide, flat nose and these wide lips. The eyes were deep set under a prominent brow ridge, but I couldn't make out their color from that distance. The weirdest part was how the head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, with barely any neck visible. For just a few seconds, couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, it stood completely still, looking up at all of us on the bridge. I couldn't tell if it was curious, threatened, or what. There was an intelligence in the way it assessed us. Not animal-like at all, more like it was considering something. Nobody on that bridge moved a muscle. I remember hearing someone behind me whispering prayers. My own heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then, without any warning, it turned away from us. No roar, no display of aggression. It just calmly turned and walked into the tree line. Not rushing, not crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something so massive. It moved with this smooth, deliberate gait that seemed impossible for its size. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the woods, branches barely moving in its wake. The silence that followed was deafening. For maybe 30 seconds, nobody said a word. Then everyone started talking at once. Some people were already backing away towards their cars. Others were pointing and trying to spot where it had gone. One guy had a camera, but admitted he'd been too shocked to take a picture. Jeff grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. What the hell was that, Travis? His face was pale, eyes wide. I couldn't even answer him. My mouth had gone completely dry. The old man in the John Deere cap shook his head. Been hunting these woods for 50 years. Never seen nothing like that. Not ever. The woman who'd mentioned Momo was already hurrying to her car, calling over her shoulder, "I'm reporting this. Y'all should too." Gradually, people started dispersing. Some headed to their vehicles. Others lingered, peering down at the spot where the creature had been. Jeff and I stayed for another 10 minutes or so, but the thing never reappeared. Finally, we walked back to my Nova in silence. The drive home was weird. We both kept starting sentences and then stopping, like our brains couldn't process what we needed to say. Finally, Jeff just said, "If we tell people about this, They'll think we're crazy or on drugs. He was right. It was 1981. No cell phones. No way to have recorded what we saw. Just our word against the assumption that we were making it up or had somehow misidentified a bear or something. When I got home that night, my parents could tell something was up. I wasn't good at hiding things from them. After some pressing, I broke down and told them everything. My dad, normally super skeptical about anything supernatural, just listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Might have been this Momo thing people have been talking about," he said, surprising me. "There have been reports coming in for years, but nobody wants to look too closely at it. Probably best you don't go spreading this around too much, Travis. People talk, and you don't need that kind of attention right now." My mum agreed. "Just be careful who you tell this to, honey. Not everyone will understand." They were right. I kept it mostly to myself. Jeff and I talked about it a few times, but even between us, it gradually became something we didn't mention much. 2 nights later, I was watching the local news with my family when a report came on about unusual sightings in southern Illinois. They specifically mentioned reports from the same night as our encounter, including one just 5 miles from where we'd been. The reporter had this smirk on his face the whole time, like he was talking about little green men or the tooth fairy. That's when I decided to really lock this story away. I went on with my life, joined the military, later became a police officer, got married, had kids, normal stuff, but I never forgot what I saw. Over the years, I'd occasionally hear similar stories or read about encounters in those parts of Illinois and Missouri. Each time, I'd get this cold feeling in my stomach, remembering how that thing had stood up and looked at us, how utterly massive it had been, how it moved with a purpose and intelligence that still haunts me. I'm 62 now, retired from both military and police work. My kids are grown, and I've got grandkids now. I still live in Illinois, though not in the same town. I've only told this story maybe 3 times in my entire life. My wife knows, my best friend from the force knows, and now, I guess, whoever's reading this knows too. I don't care much anymore if people believe me or not. I know what I saw that evening in September 1981. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't a case of mistaken identity or mass hysteria. There were at least 10 witnesses to whatever that creature was. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, wading into creeks at dusk, looking for food. I wonder if it remembers the group of humans that stood frozen on that overpass, just as shocked to see it as it might have been to see us. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. I've considered every possible explanation, but the truth is, there was something in those woods that science can't easily explain. Something that stepped straight out of legend and into my life for those brief moments. I don't go fishing in southern Illinois anymore. I don't take hikes through wooded areas if I can avoid it. Call it trauma or caution or whatever you want, but something fundamental changed in me that evening. The world got bigger and stranger, and I realized how little we really know about what shares this planet with us. I saw it. Jeff saw it. Those other folks on the bridge saw it too. And all these years later, I still sometimes jolt awake at night, my heart racing after dreaming about a pair of deep-set eyes looking up at me from a creek bank as the sun sets behind the trees. Story 13. And Dee, I know I'm supposed to be anonymous on here, but I'm going to use my real rank. I was an E5 sergeant with the US Army in the summer of 2001. It's been nearly 20 years, and honestly, I don't care anymore about the damn paperwork they made us sign. People need to know what's out there. This happened at Fort Lewis in Washington State during what was supposed to be a routine field training exercise. It was early June, still cold in the mornings, but warming up during the day. We'd been in the field for 3 days already, and I was assigned to a Humvee with 3 other soldiers. Staff Sergeant Miller driving, First Lieutenant Parker in the passenger seat, and our captain, Captain Reynolds, in the back with me. It was around 05:30, just before sunrise. The sky was starting to lighten, but the forest was still pretty dark. We were moving along one of those narrow dirt roads that cut through the training grounds, tall pines on both sides, dense undergrowth. I remember I was half asleep, nodding off every few seconds because we'd been up since 0400. The vehicle was bumping along, and I was thinking about the hot coffee waiting back at the command post. Then Miller slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly flew forward into the front seats. He shouted something I couldn't make out. I thought maybe we'd almost hit a deer or something. Then Lieutenant Parker screamed, "What the hell?" There was genuine terror in her voice, not surprise, not shock, but pure terror. I've been in combat. I know what fear sounds like. This was different. I looked up through the windshield, and that's when I saw it. About 20 yards ahead on the trail, this thing had stepped out from the tree line. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was massive. The creature turned toward our vehicle, and we all just sat there, frozen. Nobody said a word. I could hear everyone breathing hard. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It just stood there, staring at us, its chest moving with these deep, heavy breaths. The fur was this dark mahogany brown color, but its face was almost black, with lighter hair around it, almost like a frame. The strangest thing was its head seemed to sit directly on these incredibly broad shoulders. No neck to speak of. I've seen bears. I've hunted all my life, and this was no bear. I remember thinking, this can't be real. But I was seeing it with my own eyes, in broad daylight, along with 3 other trained soldiers. I'd estimate it was at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. Its chest was impossibly broad, and its arms... God, those arms hung down to its knees. They were massive, covered in that same dark fur. Its legs were thick, powerful looking, like tree trunks. I don't know how long we sat there staring at it. Probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. I finally managed to find my voice and told Miller to back up slowly. "Don't do anything to threaten it," I said. My mouth was so dry, the words barely came out. Miller started to reverse, creeping backward, and that's when everything went to hell. The thing took a deliberate step toward us. Just one step, but it was enough. Lieutenant Parker completely lost it. She drew her 9mm and fired through the windshield. 4 rapid shots, pop, 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 pop. I'm certain she hit it. At that range, with a stationary target that size, she couldn't have missed. The creature flinched and shook its shoulders, like it was shrugging off the rounds. But it didn't fall. It didn't run. It just stood there, and then... God, I'll never forget this. It pulled back its lips and showed its teeth, not in a snarl like a dog or a bear. It was different, more deliberate, like it was letting us know it was pissed. Captain Reynolds grabbed the shotgun we kept mounted in the vehicle. I brought up my M16. We were all ready to unload on this thing if it charged us. For about 10 or 15 seconds, we had this standoff. Nobody moved. I had my finger on the trigger, sighting down the barrel at this creature's chest, but something kept me from pulling the trigger. I don't know if it was fear or training or what. Then it took another step toward us. Lieutenant Parker and Miller both fired again. The thing turned, not quickly, but deliberately, and moved back about 10 or 15 yards before disappearing into the woods. It didn't crash through the brush like a panicked animal. It just moved away like it was choosing to leave. I remember Miller asking, "Should we pursue?" and Captain Reynolds immediately saying, "Fuck no. Get us back to base. Now." The drive back was dead silent. What do you say after something like that? Lieutenant Parker was shaking. Actually shaking. I've never seen an officer like that before or since. We pulled into base camp around 0600. Captain Reynolds immediately took us to the battalion commander's tent. Colonel Harrison listened to our report without interrupting. When we finished, he just nodded and said, "Stay here. Don't discuss this with anyone yet." We sat in that tent for hours. They brought us food, but I couldn't eat. I kept seeing that thing's face the way it looked at us, like it was thinking, evaluating. Around 1400, Colonel Harrison came back with Command Sergeant Major Wilson. Two full-bird colonels I didn't recognize, a guy in a Park Service uniform and some civilian in a suit with no introduction or identification. We had to tell the whole story again in detail. They asked specific questions about size, coloration, movement patterns. They wanted to know exactly how many shots were fired, where we thought they hit, how the creature reacted. They had us draw diagrams of the location, the creature's stance, everything. When we finished, the civilian in the suit spoke for the first time. This incident is being classified. You will not discuss what you saw with anyone, not your fellow soldiers, not your families, not even each other after today. Is that understood? Captain Reynolds asked. Sir, what was that thing? The civilian looked at him for a long moment and said, Captain, what you encountered was a bear, unusual in coloration and size, but a bear nonetheless. That's what your report will state. We all started to protest. That was no bear. We all knew it. But Colonel Harrison cut us off. This comes from the top. This is a matter of national security. They made us sign non-disclosure agreements. The civilian was very clear about the consequences if we broke them. Dishonorable discharge, potential imprisonment, loss of all benefits and pension. Your careers are over if you speak about this, he said. And that was it. We were dismissed. We were separated and assigned to different units the next day. I never served with any of those three again. For years I kept my mouth shut. What choice did I have? I had a family to support, a career to protect. But I never forgot what I saw that morning. I would wake up in cold sweats, seeing that thing's face, those teeth. I started researching on my own. There were other reports from that area, hikers, campers, even other military personnel who'd seen similar creatures. All unofficial, of course, all denied by authorities. I left the army in 2011, 10 years of service, honorably discharged. The NDA technically still applies, but honestly, what can they do to me now? Take away my pension? Maybe. But people need to know. What we saw that morning wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was standing right there in front of us, taking 9mm rounds to the chest and barely flinching. I've thought a lot about why they wanted to keep it quiet. My best guess is they've known about these creatures for years, maybe decades. Maybe they're studying them, trying to understand what they are, where they came from. Or maybe they're worried about public panic if people knew there were 9-foot-tall creatures capable of shrugging off bullets roaming the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I've heard other stories since then, military and government cover-ups of similar encounters. It makes me wonder how many other soldiers have seen what I saw, been told to keep quiet, and are still carrying that secret. I didn't believe in Bigfoot before that morning. I thought it was all hoaxes and misidentifications. I was wrong. These things are real. They're out there. And they're not just big, hairy apes. There was intelligence in those eyes. It was evaluating us, deciding whether to attack or retreat. It understood the weapons we were pointing at it. That's what keeps me up at night even now. Not just that these creatures exist, but that they're smart. Maybe as smart as us, and they're watching us from the trees, staying hidden, revealing themselves only when they choose to. After Lieutenant Parker fired those first shots, it could have charged us. At that distance, it could have reached our vehicle in seconds. I don't think we could have stopped it before it got to us. But it chose not to. It decided we weren't worth the trouble. That time. I often wonder if anyone's gone missing in those training grounds over the years. If someone else encountered one of these things and wasn't as lucky as we were. If there are bodies out there that will never be found, or if they were found and the cause of death was covered up like our encounter. I'm breaking my silence now because I'm tired of carrying this alone. I'm tired of being told what I saw wasn't real when I know damn well it was. 4 trained soldiers can't all hallucinate the same thing at the same time. We saw what we saw. To this day, I can't go camping. I can't even go hiking in dense forests. The sound of branches breaking makes my heart race. I'm always looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, waiting to see that massive shape step out again. I don't know what these creatures are. I don't know if they're some undiscovered species of primate or something else entirely. What I do know is they're real. They're dangerous. And for some reason, our government doesn't want us to know about them. So if you're out there in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, or really anywhere with dense woodland, keep your eyes open. Watch the shadows. Listen for footsteps too heavy to belong to any normal animal. And if you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. I've never spoken about this publicly before today. I don't know if Miller, Parker, or Reynolds ever broke their silence. I don't know if they're even still alive, but I know what we saw that morning. And now you know too. The strangest part of all this? Sometimes I think it let us go. It could have easily killed all four of us if it wanted to. Instead, it walked away. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if that was mercy, or if it was just deciding we weren't worth it yet. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. I just know it was real, and it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know. And that's what terrifies me the most. Story 14. I've never shared this publicly before. I'm not sure if I want my real name attached to this, so I'll just say I'm Laura. My husband Michael and I live in a pretty isolated spot outside Vienna, Illinois. We bought our place back in 2016, mainly because we both love the peace and quiet of rural living. Our property backs right up to a dense stretch of woods, the kind that gets pitch black at night and seems to have a personality of its own. What happened to us last year has completely changed how I feel about those woods. I used to find them beautiful and calming. Now I can't look at them without feeling watched. It started on a Tuesday evening in March 2019. I remember it was March because we just had that weird warm spell that makes you think spring is coming early. Michael and I had been working in the yard all day, clearing some brush that had accumulated over winter. Nothing unusual about the day, just normal stuff. That night around 10, I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that stopped me cold. It's hard to describe the sound exactly. It wasn't a howl or a scream. It was more like a long, deep, whooping call that seemed to echo through the trees. My first thought was maybe it was an owl, but I've heard plenty of owls living out here, and this wasn't that. It was too powerful, too deliberate. "Michael, did you hear that?" I asked. He was in the bathroom brushing his teeth and hadn't noticed. When it happened again about 15 minutes later, we both heard it. The sound was closer this time, and there was something about it that just felt wrong. Michael tried to play it off, saying it was probably just a coyote or maybe someone's dog from one of the properties down the road. But I could tell by the way he went around, checking that all the doors were locked, that he was unsettled too. "Probably just a weird echo from the valley," he said as we got into bed. "Sound does strange things out here sometimes." I nodded and tried to believe him, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling in my gut. I barely slept that night, lying awake and listening to every creak and groan of our old house. The next day was completely normal. I almost managed to convince myself that I'd overreacted, but then night came, and around the same time, maybe a bit earlier, around 9:30, we heard it again. Only this time, there was a response. We were sitting in the living room watching TV when the first call echoed from the woods behind our house. Michael muted the television, and we both sat perfectly still listening. The call came again, that same deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate right through our walls. Then, from much further away, maybe from the ridge on the other side of the small valley behind us, came an answer, a similar sound but higher pitched. "That's not normal wildlife," Michael finally admitted. "But it's probably just, I don't know, maybe hunters using calls or something." In March, at night, I asked. He shrugged, but I could see the concern in his eyes. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to what sounded like heavy footsteps on our gravel driveway. Not like a person walking, these were spaced too far apart and much heavier. I nudged Michael awake and we both sat there in the dark, listening as whatever it was moved from the driveway toward the side of the house. There was a soft thud, like something brushed against the exterior wall, and then silence. Michael wanted to go look, but I practically begged him not to. Something about the weight of those footsteps terrified me. We eventually fell back asleep with the bedroom door locked, something we never did before. The next morning, Michael checked around the house and found nothing. No footprints, no disturbances. We spent that day on edge, both of us trying to rationalize what we'd heard, but neither really believing our explanations. As the day wore on, I kept catching myself staring out at the tree line. Our backyard extends about 70 feet from the house before it meets the woods. There's no fence or clear boundary. The yard just gradually gives way to more and more trees until you're definitely in the forest. I've always loved that wild, untamed feeling, but that day it felt like the forest was encroaching, not us blending into it. Around 6 that evening, just as the sun was starting to set, Michael and I were standing under our carport. He was having a beer, and I was just getting some fresh air, trying to calm my nerves. We were talking about whether we should call the local sheriff, just to report the strange sounds. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 100 yards into the tree line, there was this shape. It was partially hidden behind one of the larger oak trees, but something about it immediately struck me as wrong. The tree trunk is maybe 2 feet wide, but whatever was behind it was clearly much broader. "Michael," I whispered, not taking my eyes off that spot. "Do you see that? By the big oak with the split trunk." He followed my gaze and I felt him freeze beside me. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. As we watched, the figure shifted slightly. It was trying to hide, but it was way too big for the tree it was using as cover. I could make out what looked like a massive shoulder. Then it would shift and I'd see what might have been part of a head. Then it would move again. It was like it was peeking at us from different sides of the tree, but never fully exposing itself. My heart was hammering in my chest. The rational part of my brain was desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just shadows from the setting sun or a trick of the light through the trees. But deep down, I knew I was looking at something real, something alive, something watching us. For almost 5 minutes, we stood there in a bizarre standoff. Us, completely exposed in our carport, and this thing, partially concealed in the woods, observing us. I've never felt more vulnerable in my life. "I'm going inside to get the binoculars," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, but I needed to see this clearly. I turned toward the door, and that's when it happened. As I glanced back over my shoulder for one last look, the figure suddenly moved. Not just the partial movements from before. This time, it broke completely away from the tree and ran deeper into the forest. And I saw it. All of it. It ran upright, on 2 legs. That's the detail that keeps me awake at night. Not hunched over like a bear might occasionally do for a few steps. This thing was fully bipedal, moving with this powerful, fluid stride that covered ground impossibly fast. It was huge, far larger than any person I've ever seen. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, with incredibly broad shoulders, and a build that was both massive and somehow athletic. The entire body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, a deep, almost black-brown color that rippled as it moved. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's would be, and they swung with its stride in this natural, balanced way. The way it moved was what struck me most. Despite its size, there was nothing clumsy about it. It was graceful, powerful, and fast, so much faster than something that size should be able to move. In seconds, it had covered maybe 50 yards of forest terrain, weaving between trees without slowing down, until it disappeared into the denser part of the woods. Michael saw it too. I know he did, because he grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. His face had gone completely white. "Get inside," he said, his voice tight. "Now!" We practically ran into the house, locking the door behind us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely help him close all the blinds and curtains. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might be having a heart attack. That raw, instinctual fear, I've never experienced anything like it. "What the fuck was that?" I kept asking over and over. "Michael, what the fuck did we just see?" He didn't answer right away. He was pacing, running his hands through his hair, occasionally peeking through the blinds toward the woods. "It wasn't a bear," he finally said. "Bears don't move like that. It wasn't a person. It was too big, too fast." We spent the next hour debating whether to call someone. The sheriff? But what would we say? We saw something big running in the woods? They'd think we were drunk or crazy. Fish and wildlife? Same problem. As night fell completely, the sounds started again. Those same whooping calls, but closer now, much closer. And there were other noises too, cracking branches, something heavy moving through the underbrush at the edge of our yard. Twice we heard what sounded like wood knocking against wood, sharp, deliberate sounds that couldn't possibly be natural. Around midnight, something hit the side of our house. Not like earlier where it had brushed against it, but like something had deliberately struck it. It was hard enough to make the windows rattle. Michael grabbed his shotgun from the safe, something he'd never done before except for hunting season. I was sitting in the hallway, as far from any windows as I could get, when Michael whispered to me, "It's on the deck." Our back deck is only about 15 feet from where I was sitting. I couldn't breathe as I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy weight making the wooden planks creak, slow, deliberate steps moving across the deck toward our back door. The door handle rattled, just slightly, like something was testing it. Michael raised the shotgun, pointing it at the door. I've never seen him look so terrified and so determined at the same time. The handle stopped rattling, and then there was silence for what felt like an eternity. Then came the smell. It seeped in through the cracks around the door, this powerful, musky odor, unlike anything I've ever encountered. Not like a skunk or anything normal. It was wild and primal, like wet fur and soil and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, something large moved away from the door. The deck creaked again as the weight shifted, and then there was a heavy thud as whatever it was jumped from the deck to the yard. We stayed awake all night, huddled together in our hallway with the shotgun across Michael's lap. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen wasn't possible, and yet we both knew it was real. When dawn finally came, Michael went outside to look around while I watched nervously from the window. There were no clear footprints in our yard. The ground was too hard from lack of rain, but our trash can had been knocked over, its contents scattered, and something had pulled down a bird feeder that was hanging from a hook nearly 7 feet off the ground. On the deck, Michael found 3 long, dark hairs caught on a nail that was slightly raised on one of the railings. They were coarse and about 5 inches long, not like human hair at all, and not like any animal fur we recognized either. We spent that day in a daze. I called in sick to work. Neither of us wanted to leave the house. We kept the blinds closed and jumped at every sound. I wanted to pack up and go to a hotel, but Michael was worried about leaving the house unattended. What if it came back and got in somehow? By afternoon, exhaustion had caught up with us, and we both fell into a restless sleep. When we woke up as evening approached, we made a decision. We needed to document what was happening. If this thing came back, we needed proof. Michael set up his phone on a tripod, pointing out the living room window toward the tree line. We turned off all the lights in the house and sat in the dark, waiting, watching. The sun set. Nothing happened. Hours passed. The woods were completely silent. Not even normal nighttime sounds of owls or insects. It was like everything was holding its breath. Around 11, Michael whispered, "Maybe it's gone." I wanted desperately to believe that. But then the silence broke. From deep in the woods came a sound that turned my blood to ice. Not the whooping call from before. This was a scream. It started low and rose to a pitch that no human throat could produce. It wasn't an animal sound either. At least not any animal that's supposed to be in Illinois woods. The scream went on, echoing through the trees before finally fading. Michael's phone was recording, capturing the sound. We sat motionless, staring out into the darkness, seeing nothing but feeling, knowing that something was out there. The screams continued intermittently for about an hour. Sometimes they seemed to come from one direction, sometimes another, like whatever was making them was circling our property. We never saw anything approach the house, though. Just after midnight, everything went silent again. The silence lasted so long that we started to relax slightly. Michael was just about to check the recording when we heard it. Heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway, just like the night before. Through the living room window, we could see the driveway illuminated by our single outdoor light. The footsteps got louder, but nothing appeared in the light. Whatever was walking was staying just at the edge of the darkness. Then, Michael's phone, still filming toward the woods, suddenly died. Not low battery, it was at 70%, but completely shut off. At that exact moment, our outdoor light flickered and went dark too. I'd like to say we were brave, that we went outside to investigate or stood our ground somehow. But the truth is, we were terrified beyond anything I've ever experienced. We retreated to the bathroom, the only room in our house with no windows, and locked ourselves in with the shotgun, our phones, and a flashlight. The sounds outside continued. Footsteps circling the house, occasional thumps against the walls, that horrible screaming, sometimes so close it seemed like it was right outside our bathroom door. And constantly that strong, wild smell seeping in through the vents. We stayed in that bathroom until morning light. When the sun came up, the sound stopped. It took us another hour to work up the courage to leave the bathroom. Our house was untouched inside, but outside was a different story. Deep impressions in the gravel driveway led from the woods to our carport and around the house. They weren't clear footprints, just places where something heavy had compressed the gravel. The bird feeder was completely gone, pole and all. And most disturbing, on the side of the house facing the woods, about 7 feet up, there were 4 long scratches in the siding, as if something with claws had dragged its hand down the wall. We packed a bag and left within the hour. Stayed with my sister in Carbondale for 3 days. When we came back, everything was normal. No sounds, no smells, no impressions in the gravel. Michael's phone video captured nothing but dark woods and those screams before it shut off. We still have the audio, but it doesn't do justice to how it felt to hear those sounds in person. We tried to analyze the 3 hairs we found, but honestly didn't know where to begin. We still have them, sealed in a plastic bag in our desk drawer. It's been over a year now, and whatever visited us those nights in March hasn't returned. At least, not that we've noticed. But I don't go out after dark anymore. We installed security cameras and motion sensor lights all around the property. Michael bought more guns. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I still hear distant whoops echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. I lie awake listening, wondering if it's coming back. Wondering what exactly it was that found us out here, all alone, and decided to let us see it. I don't have a neat explanation or a satisfying conclusion to offer. All I know is what we saw and heard and smelled. Something was watching us. Something that shouldn't exist according to science and everything I've been taught. Something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. The woods behind our house don't feel like home anymore. They feel like territory and not ours. Story 15. I've gone back and forth about posting this for a long time. It's been 4 years, and I still don't know what the hell I saw that night on Highway 72. I'm not some crazy person looking for attention. I'm a normal guy who works construction in Western Tennessee, and I've never believed in any of this kind of stuff before. But what I saw that night in February 2019 changed everything. I was driving home from a job site near Corinth, heading north on Highway 72. For those who don't know the area, it's a pretty desolate stretch of road once you get away from town. Dense woods on both sides with the occasional farm or field breaking up the tree line. It was early February, already getting dark around 5 in the afternoon. I remember it was a cold day. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and I had the heater blasting in my old Ford F-150. The sky was that weird grey-purple color it gets in winter when the sun's almost gone, but not quite. There hadn't been much traffic, maybe past 2 or 3 cars in the last 20 minutes. My mind was mostly on dinner. I'd been working since 5 that morning, and I was thinking about the leftover meatloaf waiting for me at home. I wasn't tired. I'd had a Red Bull about an hour earlier, but I was definitely on autopilot. The way you get on a road you've driven 100 times. The radio was playing some country song I wasn't really listening to. I remember checking my phone for a text from my girlfriend, then putting it back down on the passenger seat. When I looked back up at the road, that's when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was just a person standing in the road, maybe a drunk or someone whose car had broken down. But something felt off immediately. Even from a distance, I could tell this thing was huge. I slowed down from about 65 to maybe 50 as I approached, trying to figure out what I was looking at. As I got closer, maybe 100 yards away, my headlights caught it better. That's when I realized whatever this was, it was no human. It was standing right in the middle of my lane, completely still, facing away from me. I hit the brakes harder, dropping to maybe 40 miles per hour. My truck isn't the best at stopping quickly, and for a crazy second, I thought I might hit this thing. That's when it moved. I still can't process how fast it crossed the road. 3, maybe 4 strides. That's all it took for this thing to clear the entire highway. It wasn't running, more like walking, but each step covered so much ground it was unreal. It moved to the right shoulder and then turned toward my approaching truck. When it turned and I could see it fully in my headlights, my whole body went cold. I'm 6'1", and I've never felt small in my life until that moment. This thing was massive, had to be at least 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were wider than I am tall, easily spanning 4 feet across. It wasn't just tall, it was built like a linebacker on steroids, but with proportions that were all wrong for a human. It stood completely upright, not hunched over like a gorilla or bear, just standing there like a person, but impossibly large. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe a grizzly bear on its hind legs, but even that doesn't capture how massive and distinctly non-bear-like this thing was. The thing that really messed with me was its eyes. They caught my headlights and reflected back this intense yellow-green color, like a cat's eyes, but way larger. They were set deep in its face and spaced really far apart. I'd guess 6 to 8 inches between them. No animal I've ever seen has eyes like that. The face is hard to describe. It wasn't like a man's face, more ape-like, but not exactly like any ape I've seen in zoos or on TV. The skin on its face was dark and leathery looking, a brownish-black color in my headlights, while the rest of its body was covered in this uneven coat of gray-brown hair or fur. Not like a bear's even coat. This was patchy in places, thicker in others, especially around the shoulders and chest. By this point, I was about 30 feet away, still rolling forward at maybe 20 miles per hour. That's when it raised its left arm up, like it was shielding its eyes from my headlights. The arm itself was massive, longer than a human's proportionally, with what looked like a huge hand at the end of it. I didn't stop. I don't know if it was fear or just shock, but I kept driving, passing within maybe 15 feet of this thing standing on the shoulder. As I drove past, I could see it watching me, turning its body to follow my truck with those reflective eyes. I caught it in my side mirror, standing there, still watching as I continued down the road. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds from first seeing it to driving past it. 10 seconds that I've replayed in my head thousands of times since. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white and kept driving. I remember my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first instinct was to call someone, but who? What would I even say? I drove the next 20 miles like a maniac, constantly checking my mirrors to see if that thing was somehow following me. It wasn't until I got to a gas station in town that I finally pulled over. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely text my girlfriend to tell her I'd be late. I didn't tell her why, just said I needed to grab something to eat first. I sat in that gas station parking lot for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd just seen. Was it a bear? No, bears don't stand like that, and they sure as hell don't have those eyes or move like that. A person in a costume, at 9 feet tall with eyes that reflected like an animal's, in the middle of nowhere on a cold February evening. No way. I've hunted in those woods since I was a kid. I know what bears look like. I know what deer look like. I know what every animal in western Tennessee is supposed to look like, and that thing wasn't any of them. I've spent the last 4 years trying to convince myself I was just tired, that it was getting dark and my mind played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I was alert. It was still light enough to see clearly, and my headlights illuminated that thing like it was on a stage. I didn't tell anyone for months. Who would believe me? Eventually I mentioned it to my buddy Mike while we were fishing. He listened without laughing, which I appreciated, but I could tell he thought I'd seen a bear and just misjudged its size in the fading light. Maybe he's right, but I don't think so. A few weeks after I told Mike, he sent me some links to websites about Bigfoot sightings in Tennessee. I'd never given any thought to that stuff before. Always seemed like nonsense for gullible people, but some of the descriptions matched what I saw. The height, the broad shoulders, the way it moved, those eyes. I've gone back to that stretch of highway a few times since then, always during the day. I tell myself I'm just passing through on my way somewhere else, but that's not true. I'm looking for any sign of that thing. I've pulled over and walked into the woods a little way, looking for tracks or broken branches or anything that might tell me I'm not crazy. I never find anything. I don't know if what I saw was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. All I know is I saw something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught. Something that was intelligent enough to move out of the way of my truck but didn't run or hide like an animal would. Something that watched me with those eyes as I drove past. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it on that stretch of road. If they have, they're probably like me, too afraid of looking crazy to tell anyone about it. Or maybe they've convinced themselves it was just a bear or their imagination. I still drive that road sometimes for work. Every time I approach that curve, I feel my hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. My eyes scan the tree line and the road ahead more carefully. Part of me is terrified of seeing that thing again, but another part of me wants to, just so I know for sure I didn't imagine it. Last month, I was driving that stretch right around the same time of day as my original sighting. As I approached the area, I slowed down. I don't know why. Just a feeling. As I rounded the curve, something caught my eye in the woods to the right. Just a flash of movement, maybe 50 yards in among the trees. I hit the brakes and pulled onto the shoulder. The light was fading, just like it had been 4 years ago. I sat there with the engine running, staring into the woods. For a minute, nothing moved. Then I saw it again. Something large moving between the trees, too far in to see clearly. Just a dark shape moving in a way that seemed too fluid for its size. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine idling, eyes straining to see deeper into the woods. Nothing else moved. Finally, I put the truck in drive and continued home, checking my mirrors the whole way. Was it the same thing I saw 4 years ago? I don't know. Could have been a deer or even just the wind moving branches. But it felt the same, that sense that something was there watching me, something that didn't want to be seen clearly. I still don't know what to make of any of this. I'm not the type of person who believes in monsters or mysterious creatures. I'm a practical guy who deals in concrete and lumber and things I can touch. But I know what I saw that day in 2019, standing on Highway 72 in the fading light. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe someone telling me this story. All I know is that stretch of Highway 72 doesn't feel the same anymore. Every time I drive it, especially as dusk approaches, I find myself scanning the road ahead and the woods on either side, not out of curiosity, but out of a deep, primal fear of seeing those yellow-green eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I still can't explain what I saw that night. Maybe I never will. But I know what I saw was real, and it's changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that stay hidden most of the time. And sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at exactly the right time, you catch a glimpse of them. And once you do, you can never go back to not knowing they exist.